Hello, and welcome to the Snoozy Scientist. I'm really glad you made it here tonight. Wherever you are on this planet, this quiet space was made just for you, a small pocket of calm where science and curiosity can meet to guide you toward rest. Tonight, we're going to drift back farther than memory can reach to a chapter so ancient it survives only in scattered bones and silent code written deep within our DNA. The strange and beautiful story of the beings who paved the road for us. Around 6 to 7 million years ago, life took a quiet turn that would change everything. One branch of our shared ancestors remained among the trees, chimpanzees and bonobos, still masters of the canopy today. The other stepped down, onto uncertain legs, into open grasslands, and onto a path that would, in time, lead to fire, language, and eventual world domination. But those first wanderers were not human, not yet. They were creatures of two worlds, part ape, part something still forming, taking their first uncertain steps into a destiny they did not yet understand. They were small, cautious, and clever. They walked upright, though clumsily. They shaped stones into tools, though they didn't know they were shaping the future. Their minds were still bound to instinct, their days a constant battle to survive predators, hunger, and the changing earth. Scientists call them hominins, a vast, branching family of forgotten ancestors that once stood where we stand now. They were not one kind, but many. Some endured for millions of years before fading away. Others blinked out almost as soon as they appeared. Yet every one of them shaped us. The way your hands grasp, the way your hips sway as you walk, even the way you solve problems, all of it was carved by their struggles long before Homo sapiens existed. But what did these almost humans truly look like? When did they stop being apes and become something else? Tonight, we'll follow their footprints back through deep time to an era when we were neither what we were nor what we would become. If you're already enjoying this quiet journey together, it would mean so much if you gave this video a gentle like or subscribe to the channel for more softly spoken science stories. And if you'd like to share, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from tonight and what time is it there? It's always a joy to see how far this little corner of curiosity travels. So now, take a slow, deep breath, settle into the stillness, and let's begin the story of the beings who paved the road for us. If you were able to step back into the world of 7 million years ago, you would not recognize it as the place we now call home. Africa was greener then, its forests stretching wide and deep, its rivers slow and swollen from ancient rains. The air was thick with life, the buzzing and calling of creatures long vanished. And somewhere in those canopies, high above the forest floor, lived a creature that looked both familiar and strange. It was not human. It was not chimpanzee. It was the ancestor of both. Scientists do not yet know exactly what this last common ancestor looked like. Fossils from that distant moment are rare and fragmented, scattered like puzzle pieces across time. But from what little we have, we can imagine a creature small and agile, with long arms for swinging between branches and keen eyes that scanned the green world around it. It lived much as modern chimpanzees do, in close-knit groups, feeding on fruit, climbing for safety, and communicating with sounds and gestures. Yet hidden in its DNA was the potential for something entirely new, a path that would eventually lead to us. For millions of years, its descendants followed a similar rhythm, their lives shaped by the canopy. Then, something began to change. Deep beneath the ground, the planet was shifting. The great tectonic plates that make up Earth's surface were slowly grinding and colliding, raising new mountain ranges and tearing open vast rift valleys across eastern Africa. As the land changed, so too did the climate. Once continuous rainforests began to fragment, breaking apart into smaller, isolated patches. Wide expanses of open grassland appeared where thick forests had stood for ages. This transformation was not sudden. It unfolded over hundreds of thousands of years, too slowly for any one generation to notice. But for the descendants of that ancient ancestor, the consequences were profound. Populations that had once shared the same environment found themselves separated by stretches of dry savanna. Some adapted to life among the trees, clinging to the safety and familiarity of the forest canopy. Others were forced to make a different choice, to climb down and venture out into a world with fewer branches to cling to and more dangers to face. That decision, repeated generation after generation, marked the beginning of a great divide. The descendants that remained in the trees continued along a path that would eventually produce chimpanzees and bonobos, creatures still perfectly suited to a life in the forest. Those that ventured onto the ground began a new and uncertain experiment. They were no longer bound to the vertical world of the trees. Their challenges and opportunities were now on the ground. And with that new world came new pressures that would shape their bodies and their behavior in ways that would ripple forward through time. One of the first changes was posture. Moving across the open savanna required a different way of traveling. Over countless generations, those who could balance more easily on two legs had an advantage. They could see farther over the tall grass, spotting predators and food sources more quickly. They could travel longer distances with less energy, carrying what they gathered back to safety. And they could free their hands to hold objects, sticks, stones, or perhaps even the hands of their companions. This shift to upright walking was not just a physical change, it was a new way of interacting with the world. Hands that were once used only for climbing began to explore, to grasp, to manipulate. Eyes that once scanned the canopy began to sweep across the horizon. A species that once lived in the shelter of trees now faced the vastness of the open landscape, and that new perspective began to shape the mind itself. Modern genetic research has revealed just how closely our story remains tied to that of our forest-dwelling cousins. The DNA of humans and chimpanzees is almost identical, differing by less than 2%. It is a small difference on paper, yet within that sliver of genetic code lies everything that makes us who we are. It is the difference between language and silence, between fire and stone, between a species that shapes the world and one that remains shaped by it. That tiny gap is the bridge between two ways of being, and it all began with a split in a forgotten forest millions of years ago. No one living in that time could have known what was happening. To them, life was simply life, a daily struggle to eat, to find safety, to raise their young. Yet, with every step across the savannah, and every generation born into this new way of living, the future was being written. The Great Split was not a single event, but a slow, unfolding journey, one that would lead to entirely different destinies. One branch would remain much as it was, forever at home among the trees. The other would keep pushing outward, exploring, adapting, and changing step by hesitant step until the world itself was transformed. If you look back over the story of life on Earth, it might seem like a tale we know well. Museums display bones arranged in tidy timelines. Textbooks draw neat lines from ancient ancestors to modern species. And yet, beneath the surface of that order, there is a vast emptiness. The deeper we travel into the past, the more that emptiness grows. Our origin story, as carefully as science has tried to piece it together, is missing entire chapters. Part of the reason lies in the nature of fossils themselves. The process that turns flesh and bone into stone is rare and unforgiving. For a creature to become a fossil, It must die in just the right place and under just the right conditions. If a body is left on the open ground, scavengers scatter the bones and the weather grinds them away. If it falls in water too turbulent or soil too acidic, the remains dissolve before they can harden into rock. Even when the conditions are perfect, the Earth's slow shifting can bury, break, or hide those precious traces for millions of years. This means that what we find is not a complete record of the past, but a collection of lucky accidents. Entire populations vanish from history simply because none of their bones survived the long journey through time. Others might be hidden deep beneath layers of rock, too far down for us to ever reach. What we have are fragments, scattered and incomplete, and from these fragments, we try to reconstruct a story that once filled continents and ages. There is another bias at work, too, one that has shaped what we know. Fossils are far more likely to be preserved in certain environments than others. River valleys, lake shores, and ancient floodplains are among the best places for fossilization. But our ancestors did not always live near such places. Many species may have spent their entire lives in dry uplands or dense forests, where the odds of preservation were almost zero. These creatures may have thrived for hundreds of thousands of years, evolving, adapting, and shaping the future, yet they left no physical trace behind. Even the fossils we do find tell only part of the story. A single jawbone or fragment of a skull might represent an entire species. From it, scientists must infer everything: how the creature moved, what it ate, how it lived. The further back in time we go, the fewer such pieces we have, and the more we must guess about the details. Every new discovery can overturn what we thought we knew, revealing that the tree of human evolution is far more complex and tangled than we imagined. This uncertainty means that many of our ancestors likely remain hidden in the shadows of prehistory. Some species may have split from known lineages, flourished in isolation, and vanished before they were ever recorded. Others may have mingled with early humans, leaving behind no bones, but perhaps shaping our story in subtler ways. The absence of evidence does not mean they never existed. It only means they have not yet been found. In recent decades, science has begun to fill some of these gaps using tools that do not rely on bones at all. The rise of ancient DNA analysis has transformed how we understand our origins. By extracting genetic material from fossilized remains, even those that are broken or incomplete, scientists can reconstruct family trees with far greater detail. They can trace the branching patterns of evolution, measure how closely different species were related, and even detect interactions between populations that left no visible traces in the fossil record. But perhaps the most powerful tool of all is something called the molecular clock. Every living thing carries a record of time written into its DNA. As generations pass, small mutations accumulate at relatively steady rates. By comparing the genetic differences between species, scientists can estimate how long ago their lineages diverged. These molecular clocks suggest that many key events in our evolution happened earlier than the fossils alone would indicate. They hint at ghost lineages, populations that must have existed to account for the genetic differences we see today, yet whose bones have never been found. Together, these new techniques are rewriting the story of our beginnings. They show that human evolution was not a simple, straight line but a braided river, with many channels diverging and converging over time. Some of those channels are known to us through fossil discoveries. Others are traced only by whispers in our DNA, and many more still lie buried, their stories untold, waiting for the day when the earth will give them back. Even with these advances, our knowledge remains incomplete. The story of how we became who we are is built on fragments, guesses, and glimpses through the keyholes of time. What we have uncovered is enough to reveal that our origins are far older, richer, and more complicated than once believed. Yet, for every fossil displayed in a museum case, there are countless others that never formed or have yet to be found. Entire species lived and died without ever leaving their mark in stone, their existence erased by the passage of deep time. And so, our search continues. With every dig and every strand of DNA decoded, we add a few more sentences to the great unfinished story of humanity. But most of it is still unwritten, hidden beneath the soil, sealed within the code of our cells, or lost forever in the silence of the past. In the long and winding story of our evolution, some of the most important characters are the ones we know the least about. Their lives left behind no stone tools, no shelters, no paintings on cave walls. What remains of them are fragments, a skull here, a femur there, scattered clues from a time when the line between ape and human was still blurred. Yet from those fragments, a remarkable truth emerges. Before we ever spoke a word or lit a fire, we learned to stand. One of the earliest known members of our lineage is Sahelanthropus chadensis, whose fossilized skull was discovered in the sun-baked sands of Chad in 2001. This creature lived around 7 million years ago, at a moment not far removed from the last common ancestor we shared with chimpanzees. At first glance, Sahelanthropus looked little different from an ape. Its brain was small, about the size of a grapefruit, and its face still bore heavy brow ridges and a projecting jaw. But hidden within those familiar features were hints of something entirely new, taking shape. The most telling clue lies in a small hole at the base of its skull, known as the foramen magnum, where the spinal cord connects to the brain. In quadrupeds, this opening sits toward the back of the skull because their heads extend forward from a horizontal spine. In humans, it sits directly underneath, so the skull balances atop a vertical spine. Sahelanthropus shows a clear shift toward this human-like placement, suggesting that its head rested above its body rather than in front of it. It was likely capable of walking upright, at least part of the time. It was not yet a habitual biped, but it had begun experimenting with a posture that would one day define our species. A million years later, another figure would take this experiment a step further. In the Tugan Hills of Kenya, paleontologists uncovered the remains of Orrorin tuganensis, a species that lived about 6 million years ago. Only a handful of bones were found, but one of them, a femur, told an extraordinary story. The shaft of the bone was thickened in a way that suggests it regularly bore the weight of a body balanced over two legs. Its shape hints at the pull of muscles used for an upright stride, though it still retained features useful for climbing. Orrorin, it seems, was both walker and climber, moving between ground and trees with a body designed for neither world perfectly, but capable enough to survive in both. This dual existence speaks volumes about the world these early hominins inhabited. Africa in this era was a mosaic of habitats, shifting from dense woodland to open savanna as climate patterns changed. Forests thinned, rivers shifted, and the once continuous canopy broke into scattered patches. In such an environment, moving efficiently on the ground became increasingly useful. But the trees were still vital refuges, places of food, safety, and rest. The ancestors who could navigate both realms had an edge, even if neither realm felt entirely like home. Walking upright in those early days was not the effortless stride we know today. It was likely awkward and unsteady, a slow and energy-demanding way to travel compared with swinging through trees or knuckle-walking across the ground. Sahelanthropus and Orrorin were probably clumsy bipeds, their legs not yet fully lengthened for efficient strides, their pelvises not yet reshaped for perfect balance. They may have spent much of their time still climbing, descending only when necessary to forage or travel. Yet even these imperfect steps marked a profound shift in the story of life on Earth. Over time, such subtle anatomical experiments laid the groundwork for deeper changes. As species adapted to walking more often, their skeletons reshaped in response. The spine's curve evolved to better support an upright torso. The pelvis widened to create a stable platform for walking. The legs lengthened, the feet became flatter, and the toes aligned to help push the body forward. None of these transformations appeared overnight. They were the result of countless generations gradually refining a new way of moving through the world. What makes Sahelanthropus and Orrerin so important is not how human they were, but how transitional. They were neither fully ape nor fully human, but something in between, living testaments to evolution in motion. Their anatomy shows us the very beginning of a path that would eventually lead to migrations across continents, to toolmaking, to art, and to civilizations. But in their own time, they were simply survivors trying out a new solution in a changing world. The bones they left behind are few and incomplete, yet they carry an echo of the first great gamble our lineage ever took. Millions of years before the rise of Homo sapiens, before language or technology or complex societies, creatures like Sahelanthropus and Orrerin began walking into a future they could never have imagined. Their steps were uncertain, their movement imperfect, but they were the first to rise and see the world from a different angle. And with that small, tentative act, the long journey toward humanity had truly begun. Long before the first human carved a tool or kindled a flame, before footprints marked the open plains of Africa, there was a creature who did not fully belong to any one place. It lived in a world of shifting landscapes, caught between the canopy and the earth, between the safety of the trees and the risks of the ground. Its name was Ardipithecus, and it embodied a moment in evolution when survival required versatility more than perfection. The most complete remains of this ancient ancestor were unearthed in the early 1990s in the Afar region of Ethiopia. The individual, nicknamed Ardi, lived around 4.5 million years ago, long before the appearance of stone tools or organized hunting. She was small, no taller than the shoulder of a modern child, and weighed little more than a household pet. At first glance, Artie's skeleton seemed familiar, resembling that of an ape. But beneath the surface, her bones told a far more complicated story, one of adaptation, compromise, and change. Artie's hands were still long and curved, perfectly suited to gripping branches as she moved through the forest canopy. Her arms and shoulders were powerful and flexible, allowing her to swing, climb, and balance among the trees where fruit and safety could be found. Yet, unlike modern chimpanzees, she was not a knuckle walker. Her wrists lacked the locking mechanism used by four-legged apes, hinting that life on the ground played a larger role for her than it ever had for her tree-bound cousins. It is in Artie's pelvis and legs that the story becomes more intriguing. Her pelvis was neither entirely ape-like nor fully human, shaped in a way that allowed her to balance her weight when standing upright, but still flexible enough for climbing. Her legs were angled inward beneath her body, an early adaptation for walking on 2 feet. Even her feet reflected this strange duality. Unlike modern humans, Artie's big toe was opposable, allowing her to grasp branches and stabilize herself while climbing. But the rest of her foot was beginning to stiffen, forming the foundation of an arch that hinted at a future built for walking long distances. This unusual anatomy shows that Ardipithecus was a master of 2 very different worlds. In the canopy, she could climb and forage with agility, using her grasping hands and feet to move from branch to branch. On the ground, she could walk upright, awkwardly, and slowly compared to modern humans, but steadily enough to cover ground when she needed to. This ability to shift between climbing and walking was not a luxury but a necessity. Artie lived at a time when the climate of East Africa was changing. Once continuous forests were breaking apart into a patchwork of woodlands and open spaces. The resources her ancestors had once relied on were now scattered, and survival meant being able to navigate both the old environment and the new. The landscape itself shaped her behavior. The scattered patches of forest forced groups of Ardipithecus to travel across open ground in search of food and water. They likely moved cautiously, watching for predators as they crossed the exposed spaces between tree stands. On the ground, their diet may have expanded to include roots, seeds, or small animals, supplementing the fruits and leaves they collected from the trees. This broader diet, made possible by a flexible way of life, would have helped them survive in an unpredictable environment. Artie's bones also whisper clues about something even more profound: the beginnings of social change. In many modern ape species, males compete fiercely for dominance, using large canine teeth as weapons in those battles. Ardipithecus males, however, had much smaller canines. This suggests that brute force may have mattered less in their societies, and cooperation may have mattered more. Smaller canines could point to less violent competition for mates, perhaps even the early stages of pair bonding. This shift in behavior might have laid the foundation for shared parenting, where males played a role in carrying or protecting offspring, or for early forms of food sharing within groups. Such cooperation could have been essential for survival in Artie's challenging world. Bringing food back to a mate or offspring, or working together to stay safe while crossing open ground, would have strengthened social bonds and increased the chances of survival for the group as a whole. These behaviors are difficult to prove from fossils alone, but the hints they leave behind offer a tantalizing glimpse into the roots of human social life. Ardipithecus was not a creature built for speed or strength. She could not run swiftly across the savannah, nor could she leap effortlessly through the canopy like her ape relatives. But in her compromise between two worlds, she revealed a new path. By refusing to specialize too narrowly, she opened the door to adaptability, a trait that would become one of humanity's greatest strengths. When scientists look at Artie's bones today, they see more than an ancient primate preserved in stone. They see a blueprint for survival in a changing world, a body designed not for one environment but for many. Artie's life unfolded in a landscape of shifting forests and growing plains, and her ability to bridge those worlds set the stage for everything that would follow. It was in these delicate steps between tree and earth that the long journey toward humanity continued, one careful adaptation at a time. Around 5 million years ago, Africa was a place both beautiful and merciless. It was a continent in flux, shaped by shifting climates and restless landscapes. Vast grasslands stretched to the horizon, broken by pockets of woodland and winding rivers that swelled and shrank with the seasons. Herds of antelope and zebra moved across the plains in great migrations. Elephants with tusks longer than a man was tall grazed near watering holes. Giant birds stalked the grasslands, and crocodiles waded in still pools for anything careless enough to wander close. It was a thriving, teeming world, but it was also one of constant danger. For the early hominins who lived here, life was a daily test of endurance and caution. They were small and lightly built, without sharp claws or powerful jaws. They had no speed to match the gazelles, no strength to rival the lions, and no armor to protect them like the rhinos or hippos. Every rustle in the grass, every shift in the wind, could mean death. Saber-toothed cats prowled the plains, their curved fangs designed to pierce the throats of prey in a single strike. Packs of hyenas and wild dogs roamed the savannas, working together to run down their victims. Even the skies were dangerous. Giant eagles with talons the size of a human hand could snatch a juvenile from the ground before it had a chance to scream. This world offered no safety and no second chances. The early hominins were not hunters at the top of the food chain. They were prey, and in that position of vulnerability, their story took a different path. Instead of brute strength, they relied on awareness. Instead of speed, they depended on cooperation. Every choice they made was shaped by the need to avoid becoming someone else's meal. The first challenge was simple survival. Moving across open ground exposed them to predators lurking in the tall grass. Climbing back into the trees offered refuge, but the forests were shrinking as the climate shifted and the savannas expanded. Food was unpredictable too. The fruits and leaves that once grew in abundance were now scattered and seasonal. Finding enough to eat required traveling greater distances and searching in unfamiliar places. In this harsh reality, curiosity and memory became powerful tools. Those who could remember the location of a fruiting tree or recognize the signs of a hidden water source had a better chance of making it through the dry season. Scavenging became another key strategy. Rather than risk their lives chasing large prey, early hominins watched and waited. When predators abandoned a carcass, they crept in to pick the bones clean, cracking them open with stones to reach the nutrient-rich marrow inside. It was dangerous work. Arriving too soon could mean a fatal encounter with lions or hyenas. Arriving too late meant nothing was left. Success depended on timing, caution, and a growing ability to read the behavior of other animals. Over time, this sharpened their intelligence. They began to anticipate rather than react, to plan rather than simply respond. Life in this unforgiving landscape also encouraged cooperation. A lone individual had little chance against a leopard or a pack of hunting dogs, but a group, working together, could keep watch, issue alarm calls, and even drive predators away with sticks and stones. Sharing food strengthened these bonds, allowing the group to stay together during lean times. Raising young collectively ensured that more offspring survived to adulthood. Through this social web, early hominins found safety not in isolation, but in community. Even the way they moved across the land was shaped by danger. Traveling upright, as their ancestors had begun to do, allowed them to scan the horizon for threats. It freed their hands to carry tools, food, or weapons. It made it easier to spot distant water holes or fruiting trees before competitors did. Though they were still far from mastering their environment, they were beginning to understand how to read it and how to use that knowledge to stay alive. Predators and starvation were relentless teachers. They forced creativity and flexibility, pushing early hominins to think beyond instinct. They learned to observe, to wait, and to use their surroundings to their advantage. They discovered the value of working together and the power of shared memory. These adaptations were not dramatic or sudden, but over countless generations, they changed the course of evolution. The small, cautious primates of 5 million years ago were still far from the hunters and toolmakers they would one day become, but they were already learning lessons that would echo through time. In a world where survival depended not on strength but on cleverness, their minds grew sharper. In a landscape where safety lay in numbers, their social bonds deepened, and in a place where danger lurked in every shadow, the groundwork was laid for something extraordinary, a species that would not just endure the challenges of its world, but eventually rise to master them. Around 4 million years ago, Africa was a continent in transition. The once dense forests that had blanketed the land were thinning into open woodlands, scattered groves, and vast stretches of grassland. Rivers carved their way through plains that teemed with new life. Herds of antelope grazed beneath the sun, predators stalked the horizon, and towering birds watched from the distance. Amid these sweeping changes, one lineage of early hominins began to truly define itself. These were the Australopithecines, and they were the first of our ancestors to walk the earth not as occasional bipeds, but as creatures built for a life on two legs. Their fossils, found across the ancient landscapes of eastern and southern Africa, reveal a species that had left behind much of the tree-dwelling life of their forebears. They were small by modern human standards, most standing little taller than a meter and weighing about the same as a modern child. Their arms were still long and their fingers curved, a lingering adaptation from ancestors who had spent much of their lives climbing. But the rest of their bodies told a different story. Their legs were elongated and sturdy, their pelvises reshaped to support upright posture, and their spines curved into the characteristic shape that balances the weight of a vertical frame. Australopithecus had committed to a new way of moving, and with that commitment came profound changes to every part of life. Perhaps the most famous of these early walkers was Australopithecus afarensis, known from a partial skeleton discovered in 1974 in the Afar region of Ethiopia. Nicknamed Lucy, she lived about 3.5 million years ago and stood barely over a meter tall, yet her bones revealed something extraordinary. Lucy was not a climber who occasionally stood upright. She was a walker. The angle of her thigh bones, the shape of her pelvis, and the structure of her knees all showed that walking was her default. Every step she took was controlled and balanced, and her skeleton was adapted for long distances. This habitual bipedalism did far more than change anatomy. It transformed how Australopithecus lived, moved, and interacted with the world. Hands that were no longer needed for locomotion could now be used to carry objects across distances. Mothers could cradle their infants while foraging, keeping them close and safe even as they searched for food. Individuals could transport gathered plants, scavenged meat, or other resources back to a central place, encouraging a new kind of group cooperation. And groups could travel farther together, exploring new territories, following migrating herds, or reaching distant water sources. The ability to walk long distances with relative ease expanded their range and reshaped their daily rhythm. One of the most vivid glimpses into this way of life comes from a discovery in northern Tanzania. There, preserved in a layer of hardened volcanic ash, lies a trail of footprints known as the Laetoli footprints. These impressions, made about 3.5 million years ago, were left by three individuals walking side by side. They were not rushing or fleeing. Their stride was steady and purposeful. The prints show arches, aligned toes, and a rolling step, clear signs of a fully upright gait. And their spacing tells us something more. They were moving together as a group, close enough that one individual stepped directly into the footprints of another. This simple trail of steps captures something profound about Australopithecus society. It suggests coordination and possibly planning, a shared sense of direction and purpose. Traveling in groups would have offered many advantages. A cluster of eyes could watch for predators more effectively than a single pair. Cooperation could make it easier to locate scarce food or water sources. Group living also opened new opportunities for sharing and division of tasks, strengthening social bonds and increasing the chances of survival for all. The implications of this new way of life extended even further. As Australopithecus carried food back to their companions, they may have begun the earliest forms of provisioning a behavior that would later become central to human societies. Carrying young while moving allowed families to stay together while ranging across larger areas. And as groups traveled together, communication likely became more complex, laying the groundwork for more sophisticated forms of social interaction in the future. Even the shape of their bodies began to reflect the new demands of their lives. Over many generations, pelvic changes that supported upright walking also affected childbirth, allowing infants with slightly larger brains to be born. This subtle shift planted the seeds for the cognitive growth that would define our species millions of years later. Australopithecus still carried traces of its past. It could climb when necessary, retreating to the trees to avoid predators or forage for fruit. But its center of gravity had shifted. These early humans were no longer bound to the canopy. They were explorers of the ground, travelers of open spaces, and participants in a new way of living. With each step, they reshaped their relationship to the land, to each other, and to the possibilities of their future. The footprints at Laetoli and the bones of individuals like Lucy show us a moment in time when humanity's story began to accelerate. Walking upright was no longer an experiment or an adaptation born of necessity. It had become a way of life, one that allowed Australopithecus to thrive, to cooperate, and to imagine a wider world. With their eyes on the horizon and their feet firmly on the earth, they took the steps that would eventually lead to us. Long before the deliberate crafting of stone tools, before blades were shaped and hafted with care, there was a quieter beginning. It did not arrive as a single moment of brilliance, but as a series of small, clumsy experiments. It was a spark that began not with invention, but with observation. Our ancestors were starting to see the raw materials around them not as fixed parts of nature, but as something that could be bent, broken, and shaped to serve their needs. This shift from passively using the world to actively altering it marked one of the most profound transitions in our evolutionary story. The earliest evidence of this awakening does not come from carefully knapped tools, but from the silent testimony of bones scattered across ancient landscapes. At sites in modern-day Kenya and Ethiopia, some dating back more than 3 million years, scientists have uncovered animal remains bearing strange marks. These are not the ragged punctures of teeth or the random scratches of erosion. They are straight, deliberate cuts, the kind that can only be made by sharp edges. Yet no formal tools were found at these sites. Instead, it appears that some early hominin, perhaps Australopithecus afarensis or a close relative, had picked up broken stones and used them as makeshift blades. It was a subtle but transformative act. These fragments of rock were not shaped with intention, but they were chosen and used with purpose. A sharp flake could slice through hide and muscle. A heavy stone could crack the dense shafts of long bones. These actions unlocked food sources that had previously been out of reach. Where once only predators could tear into a carcass, these early opportunists could now scrape meat from bones left behind on the savannah. Where scavengers might abandon a skeleton after the flesh was gone, these proto-innovators discovered the rich marrow sealed within a hidden cache of fat and nutrients that could sustain them through lean times. The act of scavenging itself tells a story about life and death in this ancient landscape. These early hominins were not hunters stalking their prey across the plains. They lived in the shadows of more powerful predators, saber-toothed cats, hyenas, and massive crocodiles, and survival often meant arriving late to a kill, once the danger had passed and only scraps remained. But with a stone in hand, even scraps could become sustenance. This opportunistic behavior may have required patience and timing, waiting at a distance as lions fed, watching for vultures that signaled a fresh carcass, or seizing a moment when a larger predator had moved on. Every decision, every small act of boldness, could mean the difference between hunger and survival. These encounters also shaped how early hominins interacted with one another. Some carcasses were too large for a single individual to exploit alone. Working together to drag heavy bones to a safe location or to keep watch for returning predators could have improved their chances. Scavenging may have been one of the first contexts where cooperation offered a clear advantage. It was not yet the planned teamwork of future hunters, but it was a beginning, a shared effort born of necessity. The stones themselves were likely chosen for their sharpness or weight rather than shaped deliberately, but in using them, our ancestors would have begun to notice differences. Some rocks fractured more cleanly, leaving sharper edges. Some were easier to hold or more effective at splitting bone. Each encounter with these materials taught a lesson. Over time, patterns would emerge, the first glimmers of technological understanding, even if no one yet recognized it as such. A rock might be discarded after use one day, only for another to be picked up the next. Yet with each repetition, the association between stone and utility grew stronger. This was innovation in its most primitive form, not planned, not refined, but responsive and adaptive. It did not require foresight or deliberate design. It required only curiosity, memory, and the willingness to try. These traits, so simple and yet so powerful, would come to define the evolutionary path of our lineage. The environment itself may have encouraged this growing ingenuity. As climates shifted and landscapes transformed, food sources became less predictable. Forest fruits and tubers were not always available. Scavenging provided a new niche, one that rewarded creative problem solving. Stones and bones became extensions of the body, tools for survival even if they were not yet tools in the formal sense. And though these early innovations were crude, they set a precedent that would echo through millions of years of evolution. The idea that the natural world could be shaped, manipulated, and controlled. What began as opportunism would, over countless generations, evolve into intentionality. The same instincts that led an Australopithecus to pick up a sharp flake would one day lead Homo habilis to craft one deliberately. The same scavenging strategies that began as reactive would eventually give rise to planned hunts, but at this early stage, the significance lay not in what was made, but in what was imagined possible. These first sparks of innovation were more than just survival strategies. They were signs that the minds of our ancestors were beginning to shift. They were no longer passive participants in their environment. They were starting to shape it, one broken bone, one scraped carcass, one stone fragment at a time. And from these quiet beginnings, the long and extraordinary story of human technology was set into motion. Across the long sweep of human evolution, many branches of our family tree sprouted, flourished, and eventually disappeared. Some were explorers and generalists, adapting to whatever the world placed before them. Others became masters of a single way of life, evolving bodies finely tuned to the conditions they faced. Among these were the Paranthropus, a lineage that thrived for nearly 2 million years and then vanished completely, leaving behind only fossils and lessons about the dangers of being too specialized in an unpredictable world. The first bones of Paranthropus were discovered in the early 20th century in East Africa, and their appearance surprised scientists. These creatures looked both familiar and alien. They were clearly hominins, upright walkers descended from the same ancient ancestors as us, but they were not delicate or lightly built like their cousins. Instead, they were stocky and powerful, with broad faces, massive jaws, and enormous teeth. Some had a ridge of bone running along the top of the skull, an anchor for huge chewing muscles. Their faces were shaped not for speech or subtle expression, but for the relentless work of grinding tough food. Everything about their anatomy tells a story of specialization. The molars of Paranthropus were almost twice the size of those of modern humans, and their thick enamel suggests a diet filled with hard, fibrous plants. They likely fed on roots, seeds, and tubers that required hours of chewing. In some regions, they may also have eaten nuts or the woody stems of certain plants that other animals ignored. Their large jaw muscles, capable of tremendous force, allowed them to process these foods efficiently, giving them an advantage in times when other sources were scarce. For a long time, this strategy worked. Fossil evidence shows that Paranthropus spread widely across eastern and southern Africa, coexisting with several other hominin species, including early members of the genus Homo. They lived in diverse habitats, from wooded landscapes to open savannas, and they did so successfully for hundreds of thousands of generations. Their specialized adaptations allowed them to exploit a niche few others could. While other species searched for fruit or scavenged meat, Paranthropus focused on what it did best. But specialization is a double-edged sword. It can provide great success in stable conditions, yet it also makes a species vulnerable when those conditions change. Over time, Africa's climate became less predictable. Periods of drought alternated with heavy rainfall, reshaping ecosystems and altering the availability of food. Grasslands expanded, then contracted. Plants that once grew abundantly in certain regions became scarce or disappeared altogether. The very diet that had once sustained Paranthropus became harder to find. Unlike their more flexible relatives, they were not well suited to switch strategies. Their anatomy, so perfectly shaped for crushing hard vegetation, was less effective for handling a varied diet. Their large teeth were a disadvantage when trying to process meat or softer foods. Their bodies were built for a lifestyle that no longer matched the world around them. As the environment shifted, so too did the balance of survival. Meanwhile, other hominins were evolving along a different path. Members of the genus Homo were becoming increasingly versatile, capable of eating a wide range of foods. They learned to use tools to break bones, butcher meat, and gather plants that would otherwise have been inaccessible. They were more mobile, able to travel long distances in search of resources, and more adaptable to shifting landscapes. Flexibility, not strength, became the key to survival. The fossil record suggests that Paranthropus lingered for a long time, holding on as best they could in isolated pockets of suitable habitat. But their numbers dwindled as environments changed and competitors thrived. Eventually, somewhere between 1 and 1.5 million years ago, they disappeared entirely. Their extinction was not sudden or dramatic. It was a slow fading, a gradual retreat until there were none left. Yet their story is not one of failure. For nearly 2 million years, Paranthropus endured, a testament to the power of natural selection to shape life in remarkable ways. Their rise and fall offer a window into how evolution works, showing that success is always tied to the conditions of the moment. What once provided an advantage can become a liability when the world shifts beneath your feet. The bones they left behind, heavy with the marks of their unique adaptations, are reminders of how many different experiments nature conducted in the search for survival. Each branch of our family tree followed its own path, shaped by the pressures of its environment. Some, like Paranthropus, were specialists, finely tuned for a single way of life. Others, like our own ancestors, learned to be generalists, changing as the world changed around them. Both strategies had their time, but in the end, it was versatility, not strength, that carried one lineage forward while the other quietly slipped into the past. A little more than 2 million years ago, a new kind of creature appeared on the African landscape. It was not taller or stronger than the hominins that came before it. Its teeth were not sharper, its muscles not more powerful, yet this species carried something entirely new, a growing ability to shape the world around it with intention. Its name, Homo habilis, means handy human, and it marks one of the most pivotal chapters in our story, the moment when thought began to transform into technology. The world of Homo habilis was a place of extremes. Climate shifts swept across Africa, sometimes bringing lush forests and rivers, other times leaving behind dry plains and scarce water. New predators roamed the land, while herds of grazing animals migrated across vast savannas. Survival was no longer about reacting to what nature provided. It required foresight, planning, and creativity. It was in this environment that Homo habilis began to show behaviors unlike anything seen before. The fossils of Homo habilis, first unearthed in the 1960s by Louis and Mary Leakey at Olduvai Gorge, revealed a creature still small and lightly built, standing about 1.25 meters tall. But inside its skull lay a brain that had grown significantly larger than its ancestors, averaging around 600 cubic centimeters. More importantly, that brain was capable of more complex reasoning. It could plan beyond the immediate moment and imagine how a simple object might be shaped into something more useful. The evidence of this new mental leap lies scattered across ancient landscapes in the form of stone tools. While earlier species had sometimes used naturally sharp rocks, Homo habilis was the first to deliberately make them. They selected specific stones, often volcanic cobbles, collected from riverbeds, and struck them with precision to create sharp flakes and usable cores. These tools, part of what archaeologists now call the Oldowan tradition, were simple in form but revolutionary in purpose. They were no longer just stones, they were objects intentionally shaped for specific tasks: slicing flesh, chopping wood, cracking bones, or shaping plant materials. This shift from opportunistic use to deliberate creation represents one of the greatest cognitive transitions in prehistory. A tool was no longer something found by chance, but something prepared ahead of time. This required planning, knowing that a future situation would arise where that tool would be needed. It also required an understanding of cause and effect, of how striking one stone against another could produce a desired outcome. These were not just physical actions, they were mental rehearsals of future possibilities. The creation of more reliable and versatile tools transformed how Homo habilis interacted with the world. With sharper edges, they could butcher animal carcasses quickly, stripping meat before larger predators arrived. With heavier hammerstones, they could crack open bones to access nutrient-rich marrow. They could process tough plants, carve wood, and prepare hides for carrying or shelter. Each new use expanded their range of survival strategies and opened opportunities that earlier species had never exploited. But perhaps the most profound shift was not in the tools themselves, but in the way knowledge of them spread. Toolmaking was not an instinctive behavior like nest building or web spinning. It had to be learned. Evidence suggests that Homo habilis passed this knowledge from one generation to the next through observation and imitation. Younger members of the group likely watched elders strike stones and practiced the motions themselves. Over time, this learning may have involved gestures, sounds, or other early forms of teaching, the roots of communication beyond mere instinct. This transfer of knowledge marked a new stage in evolution: cultural inheritance. For the first time, survival strategies were not limited to what an individual discovered within its lifetime. They could accumulate, refine, and spread across generations. What one ancestor learned could shape the lives of descendants who would never meet them. This continuity of knowledge laid the groundwork for everything that would follow, from language to technology to shared belief systems. The hands of Homo habilis themselves tell part of this story. Fossil evidence shows that their thumbs were capable of a stronger and more precise grip than any species before them. They could hold a stone firmly and control the force of a strike with accuracy. Their dexterity, combined with their growing intelligence, created a feedback loop. The more tools they made, the more they relied on them, and the more their anatomy adapted to the task. Social life also began to change in subtle ways. Cooperative behaviors around tool use likely became more common. Some individuals may have specialized in making tools, while others used them to butcher meat or prepare plant food. Sharing of resources, already an advantage among earlier hominins, became even more critical as new kinds of food were processed and distributed. Around a communal fire or shared kill site, these early humans may have begun to develop a sense of identity as part of a group, not just as individuals surviving alone. Though they still lived dangerous lives, vulnerable to predators and changing climates, Homo habilis had crossed an invisible threshold. They had moved beyond using nature's gifts as they were and had begun to reshape those gifts to their will. Each flake chipped from a stone was a deliberate choice, each tool a small triumph of thought over circumstance. They were still far from the complex societies and technologies that would one day define humanity, but the foundation was in place. In those chipped stones, we glimpse the first glimmer of intentional technology, a quiet revolution carried out by hands that were learning not just to grasp, but to create. Homo habilis turned imagination into action, and in doing so, they set the stage for every innovation that would follow. Around 1.5 million years ago, a new kind of human stood poised on the edge of the African savannas and did something no ancestor before them had ever done. They looked toward the horizon, and they went. These were Homo erectus, and they were not content to stay where they were born. They would walk farther, hunt longer, and adapt more deeply than any species before them. Their story is one of motion and endurance, of bold migrations and clever strategies, and of a growing mastery over landscapes that stretched far beyond their ancestral home. The first fossils of Homo erectus were unearthed in the late 19th century on the island of Java. At first, scientists were puzzled. The bones were clearly human-like, upright, long-limbed, and powerful but far older than anyone had expected. As more discoveries followed in Africa, China, and Eurasia, a larger picture began to emerge. Homo erectus was not a regional curiosity. They were travelers on a planetary scale. For nearly 2 million years, they spread from the grasslands of East Africa to the forests of Europe and the river valleys of Southeast Asia, thriving in environments as varied as temperate woodlands, cold steppes, and tropical coasts. Much of their success was written into their bodies. Earlier, hominins still bore traces of a climbing past, but Homo erectus had evolved for a life spent on the move. They were taller, often more than 1.5 meters in height, with strong hips, long legs, and narrow torsos built for efficient walking and running. These physical changes did more than speed them up. They gave them endurance, the ability to keep going hour after hour across vast distances, a skill that would become central to their survival. This endurance was the foundation of a hunting strategy unlike any that had come before: persistence hunting. Instead of relying on sudden bursts of speed, Homo erectus pursued their prey over long distances under the relentless midday sun. Most large animals could outrun them, but they could not cool themselves as effectively, As the chase stretched on, the animals overheated and weakened. Eventually, they collapsed from exhaustion, allowing their pursuers to move in for the final strike. This was not just strength at work, but patience, coordination, and planning qualities that hinted at a growing intelligence beneath their heavy brows. Their expanding minds were matched by expanding skills. The tools of Homo erectus were far more sophisticated than those of their predecessors. Among their most distinctive creations were Acheulean hand axes, carefully shaped, symmetrical tools crafted from stone with skill and precision. Unlike earlier flakes and choppers, hand axes were not just cutting edges. They were multi-purpose instruments used for butchering meat, digging for tubers, scraping hides, and even shaping wood. Their standardized shapes suggest that knowledge was shared and passed down through generations, possibly through demonstration and early forms of teaching. Cultural innovation did not end with tools. Archaeological evidence hints at organized hunting parties, coordinated group activities, and perhaps even the use of simple shelters built from branches and hides. These developments point to deeper social complexity. Homo erectus was no longer a loose collection of individuals competing for resources. They were forming structured groups, cooperating to achieve common goals, and adapting their behavior to the challenges of each new landscape. It was this combination of physical endurance, technological skill, and social coordination that allowed Homo erectus to do something truly extraordinary: leave Africa. Theirs was not a single great migration, but a slow and steady spread, generation by generation, over thousands of years. By 1.5 million years ago, some groups had reached the Caucasus, leaving behind tools and bones in what is now Georgia. Others pushed east into China and Indonesia, where their descendants would persist for hundreds of millennia. Along the way, they encountered climates colder and drier than those of their homeland, and they learned to survive them. They hunted unfamiliar animals, exploited new plants, and adjusted their seasonal movements to match shifting resources. Adaptation was not just a skill for Homo erectus, it was a way of life. In the changing climates of Ice Age Eurasia, they may have made use of animal skins for warmth, sought shelter in caves, and altered their diets to include whatever resources were available. Their expanding range also exposed them to new evolutionary pressures, driving variations in body size, tool design, and cultural practices. Some groups eventually died out, but others endured, laying the groundwork for future species, including Homo heidelbergensis and, ultimately, Homo sapiens. For nearly 2 million years, Homo erectus was the most successful human species on Earth. They were the first to walk out of Africa, the first to thrive across continents, and the first to live in truly diverse environments. They were not merely reacting to the world as they found it, they were exploring, adapting, and reshaping their relationship with it. Every long-distance journey they undertook, every coordinated hunt they planned, and every hand axe they shaped was a step toward the global destiny of humankind. Their bones and tools still speak of that ambition today. They tell the story of a species that refused to remain confined, that saw beyond the horizon and kept walking. In their footsteps, the pattern of our own restlessness was set the urge to wander, to adapt, and to make the world our own. For millions of years, fire was a force that belonged to the wild. It flashed across dry plains when lightning struck, swept through forests during drought, and glowed deep beneath the earth in volcanic hearts. No creature controlled it, and none dared draw too close. But somewhere, more than 1 million years ago, our ancestors began to change that. They learned to nurture flames, to keep them alive, and eventually to summon them when needed. It was one of the most extraordinary shifts in the story of life, the moment when humans stopped merely reacting to the natural world and began shaping it to their will. The first traces of this relationship are faint but unmistakable. In places like Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, archaeologists have uncovered layers of ancient ash and burned bone dating back more than 1 million years. These clues tell a quiet story that early humans, most likely Homo erectus, were gathering around fires long before they fully understood how to make them. They may have carried embers from a lightning strike or fed a natural blaze until it burned under their care. Over time, they learned how to coax sparks into flame themselves, though exactly when that skill was mastered remains hidden in prehistory. Yet it was not simply the flame itself that changed humanity. It was what fire allowed us to become. Its glow stretched the boundaries of day and night. Where darkness once forced early humans to retreat, the circle of light gave them new hours to use. They repaired tools and sharpened spears under the glow, prepared food that would nourish them for the next day, and shared quiet moments of rest without the fear of unseen predators creeping near. In a world where survival had always been dictated by daylight, fire became a tool that bent time. And it was in those hours, when flames licked at the night and shadows danced against cave walls, that something deeper began to unfold. The fire became a gathering place, a center around which people formed bonds and shared experiences. Groups that had spent their days scattered across the landscape in search of food now came together after sunset. They exchanged gestures and sounds, passed food around the flames, and began to weave the fabric of cooperation that would define human societies. Around the fire, we did more than survive together. We began to think together. Storytelling likely took root here, in the hush that followed a long day's work. Long before words were etched into stone or inked on paper, they were spoken into the dark, carried by the crackle of the flames. Stories about the hunt, about ancestors, about the spirits of animals and storms. These were not mere entertainment. They were memory, wrapped in imagination and shared across generations. They taught lessons, preserved knowledge, and gave meaning to the experiences of the group. Fire was more than warmth. It was the first stage on which culture unfolded. The presence of fire also changed how humans related to the natural world around them. It offered a measure of control that no other animal possessed. With fire, they could choose where to sleep, confident that predators would keep their distance from the light and heat. They could linger on the ground rather than retreating to the trees. They could remain in places that had once been too cold to inhabit, carrying warmth wherever they went. In a fundamental way, fire reshaped the limits of where humans could live and how they could move through their environment. Beyond safety and comfort, fire became a tool for planning. Controlled burns cleared landscapes, allowing fresh growth to attract grazing animals. Flames could flush game from hiding or make certain plants easier to harvest. Heated wood hardened spear points, making weapons more effective. Much later, fire would be used to transform stone and metal, but even in these early days, it served as a kind of bridge between human intention and the raw forces of nature. Where once humans adapted passively to their surroundings, they were now actively reshaping them. Perhaps most importantly, fire forged a deeper sense of community. The shared maintenance of a flame-gathering fuel, tending embers, passing knowledge of how to keep it alive, required cooperation. It demanded memory and foresight, planning for nights yet to come. These were not just physical skills, but cognitive ones, pushing human minds to think beyond the present moment. The fire that burned before them was both a tool and a teacher, reminding them that survival was not just about reacting to the world as it was, but about imagining how it could be. The taming of fire was more than a practical achievement. It marked a shift in the rhythm of human life. Days no longer ended with the setting sun. Safety no longer depended solely on strength or speed, and the stories, memories, and plans shared around the fire's edge became the foundation for language, culture, and imagination itself. In its flickering light, humans found more than heat and protection. They found one another, and in doing so, they began to see themselves not as creatures bound by nature's forces, but as shapers of their own destiny. For all the time humans have existed, we have lived on a planet that never stops changing. The ground beneath our feet, the climate around us, the resources we depend on, none of it has ever stood still. The Earth is a restless place, shaped by cycles of ice and heat, by droughts that lasted centuries, and by sudden disasters that rewrote entire landscapes in the space of a few seasons. And it was this relentless unpredictability, more than any single event, that forged the species we would become. Around 2.5 million years ago, the planet entered the Pleistocene, a chapter of deep, cold, and dramatic swings. Massive sheets of ice expanded from the poles, blanketing continents under layers a mile thick. As temperatures plunged, oceans receded, exposing new land bridges while locking water into towering glaciers. Then, as the Earth's orbit and tilt shifted, the ice retreated and the world warmed again. Sea levels rose, coastlines shifted, and lush grasslands replaced frozen plains. This cycle repeated over and over, each lasting tens of thousands of years. For early humans, it meant that no environment was ever permanent. A region rich in plants and animals might become a frozen desert within a handful of generations and then flood into wetlands not long after. This constant instability reshaped not only where our ancestors lived, but how they lived. Each swing of the climate disrupted food sources, altered migration patterns of prey, and redrew the map of habitable regions. In wet periods, rivers teemed with fish and fruit trees flourished. In dry ones, lakes evaporated into dust and animals disappeared into distant valleys. To survive, humans could not simply adapt once. They had to keep adapting, generation after generation, learning to read the land and anticipate its moods. One of the most profound consequences of this shifting world was movement. Climate change forced early humans to migrate again and again in search of food, water, and safety. Expanding deserts pushed groups out of familiar territories. Glacial advances drove them south into warmer lands. As they followed the changing landscapes, they encountered unfamiliar plants, strange animals, and challenging new conditions. This exposure to diversity became a powerful evolutionary pressure. Populations that stayed flexible, altering their diets, adjusting their hunting strategies, inventing new tools survived and spread. Those that did not vanished. Innovation often arose from desperation. During long dry spells, edible plants became scarce and herds grew smaller. This scarcity pushed early humans to experiment. They learned to dig deeper for water and tubers, to crack hard-shelled nuts, and to store food during times of plenty. They began to coordinate more complex hunts, driving animals toward natural traps or ambushing them in groups. These were not random acts of chance. They were deliberate responses to an environment that demanded creativity just to stay alive. Some of the most extreme climate events left even deeper marks. Roughly 135,000 years ago, Africa experienced a series of intense droughts that may have pushed Homo sapiens to the edge of extinction. Lakes dried into salt flats, forests withered into scrubland. Genetic evidence suggests that our population may have fallen to just a few thousand breeding individuals, a tiny remnant of what once was. Yet, even in this crucible, ingenuity emerged. Some groups turned to coastal resources, learning to harvest shellfish and fish when inland food vanished. Others migrated into new regions altogether, seeking out river valleys or refuges where rain still fell. These desperate strategies would become the foundation of future migrations that carried humanity across the globe. Not all challenges unfolded slowly. Volcanic eruptions could darken skies in a matter of days, plunging the planet into cold seasons that lasted for years. Shifts in ocean currents could transform wet regions into deserts within a few decades. These rapid shocks tested human adaptability in new ways. Groups that survived were those that could change quickly, altering their tools, food strategies, and social behaviors to meet the new reality. These experiences honed not just our physical endurance, but our capacity for planning, cooperation, and innovation. Technology, too, was shaped by this chaotic world. Early humans created clothing from hides to withstand frigid glacial winds. They built shelters to survive long winters and devised new hunting weapons to take down large Ice Age megafauna. In times of scarcity, they developed ways to preserve food or move seasonally to follow migrating herds. The need to survive in constantly shifting conditions sharpened intelligence and deepened social bonds, pushing human culture forward in ways that comfort and abundance never could. By the time Homo sapiens began their great exodus from Africa roughly 70,000 years ago, they were no longer simply reacting to environmental change. They had learned to anticipate it. They carried fire with them into frozen lands. They crafted tailored clothing and planned seasonal migrations. They tracked the stars to navigate across vast distances and read subtle signs in the landscape to find water in arid regions. The unpredictability of the Earth had become not a threat, but a challenge one our species was now uniquely equipped to meet. Every drought, every ice age, every sudden disaster shaped us. It was not in times of stability that humanity flourished, but in times of chaos when only adaptability, creativity, and cooperation could ensure survival. The planet's turbulence was not an obstacle to our rise. It was the forge that tempered us, turning fragile primates into the resourceful, imaginative beings who would one day step beyond their birthplace and roam the world. Around 700,000 years ago, a new branch of humanity stepped into a world that demanded not just survival, but strategy. These were not the opportunistic scavengers or lone hunters of the past. They were thinkers, planners, and organizers, a species capable of working together with precision and intent. Scientists call them Homo heidelbergensis, and they stand at a pivotal point in our story. From them would come the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, and ultimately, us. But their most defining trait was not strength or size. It was the way they learned to think like hunters as individuals bound together by shared purpose. The world they inhabited was unpredictable and often unforgiving. Vast herds of deer, horses, and aurochs roamed the grasslands of Europe and Africa. Massive elephants and woolly rhinoceroses lumbered across open plains. Predators prowled the forests, and winters could arrive with brutal force as glaciers crept southward. In this challenging environment, brute force alone was no longer enough to secure food. Large prey could outrun or overpower a single hunter. Only coordination, careful planning, and timing could tip the balance. Archaeological evidence suggests that Homo heidelbergensis was the first human species to truly master large-scale, organized hunts. At sites like Boxgrove in England, butchered remains of horses and red deer show cut marks made by stone tools, suggesting that multiple hunters worked together to bring down and process their prey. These were not random kills. They were the result of planned, cooperative efforts, strategies that likely involved surrounding herds, driving animals toward natural barriers, or forcing them into ambush zones where hunters waited with weapons ready. One of the most striking discoveries comes from Schoningen, Germany, where archaeologists uncovered several perfectly preserved wooden spears, each over 6 feet long. These were not crude branches, but carefully shaped weapons, balanced for throwing and designed for lethal impact. Their craftsmanship shows forethought, the choice of strong, flexible wood, the careful shaping of tips, and the understanding of how weight distribution affects flight. Such weapons hint at coordinated hunting tactics, perhaps one group driving animals into the open while others waited to strike from a distance. This level of organization suggests communication far beyond the simple calls and gestures of earlier hominins. While direct evidence of language is impossible to recover, many scientists believe Homo heidelbergensis possessed a form of proto-language, a structured system of vocalizations and signals that allowed for planning and coordination. Successful hunts likely depended on sharing information, where the herd was moving, when to attack, how to encircle the prey. Subtle hand signals, rhythmic calls, or repeated sound patterns might have helped synchronize group actions, laying the groundwork for more complex language in future species. Social structure itself appears to have grown more sophisticated during this period. Evidence from living sites suggests that Homo heidelbergensis lived in groups large enough to require organization and leadership. Within these groups, roles may have begun to emerge. Skilled spear throwers, scouts who tracked animal movements, and elders who remembered migration patterns or seasonal changes. Such division of labor would have increased hunting success, but it also points to a deeper shift, a society where individuals depended on one another's skills and knowledge for survival. Beyond hunting, their strategic thinking extended to shaping their surroundings. They constructed simple shelters from wood, stone, and animal hides, providing protection against harsh weather and allowing them to remain in one place longer. These structures became centers for planning, tool making, and perhaps even social rituals. Control of fire, which was becoming increasingly common during their era, transformed these shelters into true homes, places where groups could cook, stay warm, and share information late into the night. What is most remarkable is how far Homo heidelbergensis ranged. Their remains and tools have been found across Africa, Europe, and as far east as China, proving they could adapt to wildly different environments. In temperate forests, they hunted deer and boar. On wind-swept steppes, they targeted large grazing animals. In colder climates, they may have coordinated seasonal migrations to follow herds or retreated into sheltered valleys during harsh winters. This adaptability required more than physical endurance. It demanded foresight and understanding of how landscapes, seasons, and animal behaviors could be turned into opportunities. Over time, these behaviors laid the groundwork for deeper social bonds. Cooperative hunting meant that food had to be shared, which likely strengthened trust and interdependence within groups. Communication during hunts may have expanded into storytelling, teaching, and planning for the future. Knowledge of animal migrations or tool-making techniques could be passed across generations, creating a shared memory, an early form of culture that stretched beyond the lifespan of any individual. Homo heidelbergensis was more than a hunter. They were strategists, engineers, and proto-communicators. Their hunts were not just about food, but about cooperation and shared intent. Their shelters were not just places to sleep, but centers of planning and social life, and their weapons were not just tools of survival, but symbols of a growing intelligence that could shape the world around them. In their careful strategies and coordinated hunts, we see the first shadows of behaviors that define humanity today: teamwork, communication, leadership, and shared purpose. They were not yet us, but they were the ones who showed that survival could be achieved not just by strength, but by thought. And in doing so, they set the stage for everything that would follow. When the first Neanderthal bones were uncovered in a limestone cave in Germany in the mid 19th century, scientists imagined they had found a brutish, primitive creature, a dim shadow on the path to modern humanity. For decades, that image persisted, stooped, slow witted, and doomed to extinction. But as the evidence has grown, that picture has dissolved. Today, we know the Neanderthals were something far richer and more complex. They were thinkers, artists, caretakers, and builders. They were not a lesser version of us, but another way that humanity once existed. Neanderthals appeared around 400,000 years ago, descendants of Homo heidelbergensis populations that had migrated into Europe and adapted to its demanding climates. They were powerfully built, shorter and stockier than modern humans, with wide rib cages, strong limbs, and large hands built for gripping and tool making. Their skulls were elongated, their brows pronounced, and their noses broad, adaptations that helped them warm and humidify the icy air of Ice Age Europe. But behind those heavy brows was a brain every bit as impressive as our own, in fact, slightly larger on average. For hundreds of thousands of years, Neanderthals thrived in a world that would have been brutal for most species. They mastered the cold landscapes of Ice Age Europe and Western Asia, living through cycles of glaciation that reshaped forests into tundra and back again. Their survival was not the result of brute strength alone. It was their intelligence, ingenuity, and deep social bonds that allowed them to flourish in such unforgiving conditions. Their tools, for instance, reveal remarkable sophistication. Neanderthals shaped stone into finely crafted points, scrapers, and blades, often tailoring tools to specific purposes. They knew how to haft stone points onto wooden shafts, creating deadly spears for hunting. They even used fire-hardened wood as a weapon, a testament to their knowledge of how to manipulate materials. At sites like La Côte de Street Brelade, there is evidence that they coordinated complex hunting strategies, driving mammoths and other large animals into natural traps. Yet it is in the realm of culture that Neanderthals truly challenge our old assumptions. They were not simply practical toolmakers, but symbolic thinkers. In caves across Europe and the Near East, archaeologists have found evidence of pigment use, suggesting they painted their bodies or objects. At some sites, they collected eagle talons and shells, likely worn as ornaments. These were not items of survival, but of meaning, hints that Neanderthals had an aesthetic sense and perhaps even a concept of identity. They also cared for their dead. One of the most striking discoveries comes from Shanidar Cave in Iraq, where the remains of a Neanderthal were found carefully placed in a shallow grave, surrounded by traces of pollen. Whether the flowers were placed intentionally or simply blew in by chance remains debated, but the arrangement suggests a deliberate act. Similar burials appear across their range, many showing signs of care and ritual. They did not abandon their dead to the elements. They laid them to rest. Such behavior implies something profound. Neanderthals may have contemplated life and death, memory and meaning. They likely possessed language too. The structure of their vocal tracts and genetic evidence linked to speech strongly suggest they were capable of complex vocal communication. If they did speak, they would have shared stories, warnings, and plans, weaving language into the fabric of their daily lives, just as we do. Social life among Neanderthals was deeply cooperative. They lived in small, close knit groups and depended on one another for survival. Injured individuals were often cared for long after their injuries would have prevented them from contributing to the group, showing a level of empathy and mutual support rarely seen in the animal kingdom. They shared food, raised children communally, and likely maintained networks of interaction with neighboring groups. For hundreds of thousands of years, this way of life worked. Neanderthals endured ice ages, hunted enormous animals, and adapted to shifting climates. They were not a brief evolutionary detour, but one of humanity's most successful experiments, surviving far longer than our own species has existed so far. And then, around 40,000 years ago, they were gone. The reasons for their disappearance remain one of prehistory's great mysteries. As Homo sapiens spread into Europe and Asia, competition for resources likely intensified. Modern humans may have been more adaptable, forming larger social networks and developing new technologies. Climate fluctuations at the end of the Ice Age may have further strained Neanderthal populations, fragmenting their habitats and reducing their numbers, yet their story did not end entirely. Genetic evidence shows that Neanderthals and modern humans interbred multiple times. Today, most people of non-African descent carry between 1 and 2% Neanderthal DNA, a living trace of that ancient connection. Those genes influence our immune systems, our skin, even our ability to process certain nutrients. The Neanderthals were not a failed version of humanity. They were humanity, a different branch of the same tree, a parallel story that unfolded beside our own. They built lives filled with art, cooperation, memory, and care. They stood beneath the same stars, pondered the same mysteries, and shaped the same earth we walk on now. And though their bodies vanished long ago, their minds, their creativity, and their blood still run quietly within us. High in the cold, wind-swept Altai mountains of Siberia, there is a small, unassuming cave carved into the rock. For thousands of years, animals sheltered here, people lit fires here, and winter snows drifted silently at its entrance. It is not a place that seems destined to rewrite human history. Yet in the early 2000s, archaeologists sifting through its sediment unearthed a tiny fragment of bone, a piece so small it could rest on a fingertip. It belonged to a young girl who lived more than 40,000 years ago, and from that single fragment, a hidden chapter of our story began to unfold. When scientists first examined the bone under a microscope, it offered few clues. It was clearly hominin, but it did not match any known species. It was not Homo sapiens, nor Neanderthal, nor any of the other ancient relatives we had already identified. For a time, it was a mystery without a name. Then, with the arrival of advanced genetic sequencing techniques, scientists extracted DNA from the fragment. What they found changed everything. The genetic code inside that tiny bone revealed a previously unknown lineage of humans. They were named after the cave where they were discovered, the Denisovans. What makes the Denisovans so remarkable is not how much we know about them, but how little. Aside from that first finger bone, scientists have identified a few teeth, a fragment of a skull, and a piece of a long bone. That is all the physical evidence we have. Yet, from these fragments and the genetic clues they hold, a picture is slowly emerging, one that reveals a population of humans who once spread across vast regions of Asia and left an indelible mark on our DNA. The genetic evidence shows that Denisovans were a sister group to the Neanderthals. Both species likely descended from a common ancestor that left Africa hundreds of thousands of years before Homo sapiens evolved. As Neanderthals moved west into Europe and the Near East, Denisovans spread eastward into Central East and Southeast Asia. They thrived for hundreds of thousands of years, adapting to a wide range of environments, from frigid mountain ranges to tropical forests. Their legacy is most clearly visible not in the ground, but in the blood of people living today. Genetic studies show that Denisovans interbred with Homo sapiens on multiple occasions. As a result, many modern populations carry traces of their DNA. In parts of Melanesia and Papua New Guinea, as much as 5% of the genome can be traced back to Denisovans. Indigenous peoples of Australia, certain groups in Southeast Asia, and some populations in East Asia all carry pieces of their genetic heritage. Even people living on the Tibetan Plateau share a crucial Denisovan gene that helps them thrive in low oxygen, high altitude environments, an adaptation that likely allowed our species to settle such extreme landscapes. These genetic echoes tell us that the Denisovans were not isolated or rare, they were widespread, numerous, and deeply entwined with our story. They were there when Homo sapiens first moved into Asia, and their encounters shaped who we are today. Yet despite this lasting influence, they remain among the most mysterious of our relatives. Part of that mystery lies in the gaps in the fossil record. Unlike Neanderthals, who left behind countless skeletons, tools, and traces of culture, Denisovans are ghosts in the archaeological record. We do not know what they looked like, how they lived, or what kinds of tools they made. There are hints stone artifacts found near Denisovan remains suggest they were skilled toolmakers, and where patterns on their teeth indicate a varied diet, but so much remains unknown. Even their geographic range is uncertain. Genetic evidence suggests they lived far beyond the Altai Mountains, possibly reaching as far as Indonesia and the islands of Oceania. Some researchers believe they may have interbred with yet another, as yet unknown hominin species in Asia, hinting at an even more complex evolutionary web than we imagined. Each new discovery seems to deepen the mystery rather than solve it. The most haunting clue about the Denisovans came in 2018 when scientists sequenced the DNA of another bone fragment from Denisova Cave. It belonged to a young girl whose mother was a Neanderthal and whose father was a Denisovan. This remarkable finding proved that not only did Denisovans interbreed with modern humans, they also interbred with Neanderthals, blurring the boundaries between species. Humanity, it seemed, was never a straight line of evolution but a braided river, with different branches merging, diverging, and flowing together again. Today, Denisovans remain a scientific enigma. Their story is told not through towering skeletons or painted cave walls, but through the microscopic code hidden in our genes and the few fragile bones retrieved from the earth. They remind us that the human family was once far larger and more interconnected than we once believed. Entire populations lived, thrived, and vanished, leaving behind only whispers of their existence. And yet, those whispers are part of us. They are carried in our blood, shaping our biology and influencing our abilities. The Denisovans are not gone. They live on in the oxygen coursing through the veins of a Sherpa on the slopes of Everest, in the genes that help people fight diseases, and in the shared human story that stretches back far beyond written history. From a single finger bone in a Siberian cave, they stepped out of the shadows of deep time and into the heart of who we are. On a humid afternoon in the year 2003, deep within a limestone cave on the Indonesian island of Flores, archaeologists brushed away layers of earth and came face to face with one of the greatest surprises in the story of human evolution. Lying buried in the ground was a tiny skeleton, scarcely over 3 feet tall, with delicate bones and a skull no larger than that of a chimpanzee. At first, the scientists assumed it must belong to a child, but as they examined it more closely, They realized this was no child. It was an adult member of a previously unknown human species. They named it Homo floresiensis after the island where it was found, but the discovery quickly earned a more whimsical nickname, the Hobbit. The name was fitting, for this was a human unlike any other. Standing little more than 3.5 feet tall and weighing about 55 pounds, Homo floresiensis was smaller than any other member of the human family known at the time. Its brain, too, was astonishingly small, roughly the size of a grapefruit. Yet it was clear from the tools found near its bones that this tiny species was intelligent, capable, and resourceful. The story of Homo floresiensis is a lesson in the strange power of evolution, especially when it unfolds in isolation. Flores is a rugged, volcanic island ringed by treacherous seas. Reaching it, even today, is no small feat. For ancient humans, it was an even greater challenge. The ancestors of Homo floresiensis must have crossed open water to get there, possibly on simple rafts or by clinging to floating vegetation. Once they arrived, they found themselves in a world that operated under very different rules. On islands, size often becomes a matter of survival. Resources are scarce, and large bodies require more food and water. Over generations, many species shrink to fit their environment, a process known as island dwarfism. Elephants become pygmies, deer grow smaller, and even predators shrink to conserve energy. Humans, too, are not immune to this pressure. Scientists believe that Homo floresiensis descended from an early population of Homo erectus, the same species that spread across Asia and Africa more than 1 million years ago. Once isolated on Flores, they gradually became smaller, adapting to the limited resources and unique challenges of their island home. But while their bodies changed, their ingenuity remained. Excavations at Liangbua Cave, where the first skeleton was found, revealed an array of stone tools, carefully crafted flakes and points used to butcher animals and process plants. The tools show planning and skill, suggesting that Homo floresiensis was capable of complex thought despite its small brain. They also hunted. Bones of the extinct dwarf elephant stegodon have been discovered alongside stone tools, indicating that these tiny humans brought down prey many times their size. Their island was full of unusual creatures. Alongside Homo floresiensis lived giant storks, enormous lizards related to today's Komodo dragons, and oversized rats that would have been a valuable food source. Navigating this landscape required resourcefulness and adaptability. Despite their size, Homo floresiensis survived for hundreds of thousands of years in this isolated world, proving that intelligence is not measured by brain volume alone. One of the most remarkable aspects of their story is how recently they lived. Fossil evidence suggests that Homo floresiensis may have survived until as recently as 50,000 years ago, which means they shared the Earth with Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. It is even possible, though unproven, that our ancestors encountered them on their journeys through Southeast Asia. If they did, it would mean that 3 distinct kinds of humans once walked the same lands: modern humans, Neanderthals far to the west, and these small, mysterious island dwellers. The existence of Homo floresiensis challenged long-held assumptions about human evolution. Scientists once believed that intelligence and large brains went hand in hand, that smaller species were evolutionary dead ends. Yet here was evidence of a species that defied that logic, a species that thrived with a brain barely a third the size of ours. Their success showed that survival is not a simple matter of size or strength, but of adaptation, creativity, and resilience. The discovery also raised profound questions. Were they descendants of Homo erectus, Or could they represent an even earlier branch of the human tree that left Africa long before? Did they interact with modern humans? And why did they disappear? Some scientists believe volcanic eruptions or climate change may have played a role. Others think the arrival of Homo sapiens on nearby islands could have led to their extinction. Whatever the reason, their disappearance marked the end of one of evolution's most fascinating experiments. Yet their legacy lingers. The bones of Homo floresiensis remind us that human evolution is not a straight line from primitive to advanced. It is a branching, twisting story full of surprises. On a small island in Indonesia, evolution took a different path, one that produced humans who were small but capable, isolated but ingenious. They were proof that there are many ways to be human, and that our family's story is far more complex and wondrous than we once believed. And though their voices have long since fallen silent, the echo of their ingenuity still reaches us, carried on the wind that rustles through the forests of Flores, whispering of a time when tiny humans thrived on the edge of the world. In the year 2013, deep beneath the hills outside Johannesburg, a team of cavers crawled into a narrow underground chamber so cramped that even the slimmest among them could barely squeeze through. The passageways twisted and dropped into darkness, opening into hidden chambers that had not been touched by sunlight for hundreds of thousands of years. And there, scattered across the cave floor, lay the bones of a species no one had ever seen before. They were strange bones. They belonged to a creature that walked upright like a human, but had a small, delicate frame. Its hands were capable of gripping tools, its legs built for walking long distances, and yet its skull was tiny, its brain no larger than that of an orange. Scientists named this new species Homo naledi, after the rising star cave where it was found, and almost immediately, the discovery began to rewrite what we thought we knew about intelligence, behavior, and the very definition of what it means to be human. The fossils were unlike anything else in the human family tree. Homo naledi was small, standing around 4.5 feet tall and weighing less than 100 pounds. Its skull was a curious mix of ancient and modern traits. A tiny brain, just about 1/3 the size of ours, but a face and teeth that shared similarities with early members of the genus Homo. Its long legs and arched feet showed that it walked upright with ease, while its curved fingers hinted at climbing ability, perhaps a legacy from an ancestor that still spent time in the trees. At first glance, it seemed to be a primitive species, perhaps a relic from a much earlier chapter of human evolution. But the context of the bones told a far more surprising story. They were not scattered randomly, as if washed into the chamber by floodwaters or dragged there by predators. Instead, they were clustered in ways that suggested deliberate placement. There were no signs of habitation, no evidence that the chamber had ever been a living space. It appeared that Homo naledi had intentionally carried their dead into the depths of the cave and left them there. This was shocking because such behavior had long been considered the hallmark of large-brained species like Neanderthals or Homo sapiens. Burial, or even the deliberate placement of the dead, was thought to require abstract thinking, an awareness of life and death, memory, and perhaps even a sense of identity. Yet here was a species with a brain barely larger than that of a chimpanzee, behaving in a way that seemed deeply symbolic. The implications were staggering. If Homo naledi had indeed carried their dead into the cave, it meant that intelligence did not always require a large brain. It meant that complex behavior could emerge in unexpected ways, perhaps driven by social cooperation, emotional bonds, or learned traditions. It suggested that the roots of human-like behavior were deeper and more widespread than anyone had imagined. The rising star chamber held more surprises. The number of individuals found more than a dozen indicated that this was not an isolated event, but a repeated practice over many generations. And further evidence hinted that Homo naledi might have used fire to navigate the dark, twisting tunnels. Burn marks on the walls and fragments of charred material suggested that they had illuminated their path into the cave's depths. If true, this would mean they were capable of planning and using technology in ways that rivaled much larger brained species. Dating the fossils only deepened the mystery. Initially, scientists assumed that Homo naledi must have lived in the distant past, perhaps 2 million years ago, when small brained hominins were common. But when the bones were finally dated, they were far younger, between 236,000 and 335,000 years old. This placed them firmly in an era when Homo sapiens and Neanderthals already existed. It meant that a small brained, seemingly primitive human species had survived deep into a time once thought to belong only to our more advanced relatives. This revelation forced scientists to reconsider long held assumptions. Brain size alone could no longer be treated as the measure of intelligence. The story of Homo naledi showed that cognition could arise in unexpected ways, that complexity could emerge in species that did not fit the old patterns. Intelligence, it seemed, was not a straight ladder but a tree with many branches, each finding its own solutions to the challenges of survival. Even now, the motives behind Homo naledi's actions remain uncertain. Did they understand death in the way we do, or was the placement of the dead driven by practical concerns, such as keeping predators away from their living spaces? Were they capable of symbolic thought, or did their behaviors emerge from instinct and imitation? These questions linger, unanswered, in the darkness of the rising star cave. What is clear is that Homo naledi changed how we see ourselves. Their bones remind us that intelligence is not a singular trait reserved for the biggest brains, but a spectrum of possibilities shaped by environment, cooperation, and chance. Hidden beneath the ground in a remote South African cave, they teach us that even in the smallest of minds, the spark of human-like behavior can burn brightly, a reminder that the story of humanity is far richer and more intricate than we ever imagined. For millions of years, our ancestors shaped stone, lit fires, and hunted with tools. They learned how to survive and even thrive in a world that often seemed indifferent to their struggles. But somewhere in that long story, a deeper shift occurred, one that cannot be measured in tools or bones alone. It was the moment the human mind began to reach beyond the physical world. It was the birth of symbolism, when meaning itself became a tool and ideas began to shape reality. The first sparks of symbolic thought are faint in the archaeological record, but their significance is enormous. They appear in patterns carved into stone, in pigments carefully ground and applied to skin or objects, and in items placed beside the dead for reasons that had nothing to do with practicality. These traces reveal something extraordinary. Our ancestors were no longer responding only to the immediate demands of survival. They were thinking about identity, memory, belief, and the invisible worlds that lie beyond the senses. One of the most revealing windows into this mental transformation comes from a site called Blombos Cave on the southern coast of Africa. Here, archaeologists uncovered pieces of ochre, a naturally occurring iron-rich pigment etched with deliberate crosshatched designs more than 75,000 years ago. These are not accidental scratches or random doodles. They are purposeful marks, repeated and structured, created by minds capable of abstract thought. They served no practical purpose. Instead, they represented something else, an idea, a symbol, a meaning understood by those who made and saw them. Ochre itself seems to have held special significance. Across many ancient sites, it appears not just as a pigment, but as a marker of identity and ritual. People painted their bodies with it, perhaps to signal belonging to a group, to mark important life events, or to prepare for ceremonies. In some burials, ochre was sprinkled over the dead, a striking clue that early humans may have held beliefs about death and transformation. These acts speak to minds beginning to grapple with concepts that cannot be seen or touched: life, death, spirit, memory. The evidence of symbolic behavior is not confined to a single place or time. At sites in what is now Israel, perforated marine shells stained with pigment, likely worn as necklaces or sewn into clothing, date back nearly 100,000 years. These ornaments had no survival function. Their purpose was to communicate something intangible: status, identity, or perhaps even beauty. In Europe, at Grotte du Renne in France, Neanderthals too seem to have engaged in symbolic acts, using pigments and creating personal ornaments. Symbolism, it seems, was not uniquely ours. It was a spark shared across different branches of the human family. As the capacity for symbolic thought grew, it blossomed into new and astonishing forms. The cave walls of Europe bear witness to this change. In the deep chambers of Lascaux, Chauvet, and Altamira, ancient artists painted powerful scenes of animals: bison in full charge, mammoths looming in torchlight, horses frozen mid-gallop, alongside abstract signs and handprints. Many of these paintings are more than 30,000 years old, yet they reveal a deep understanding of form, movement, and storytelling. These were not decorations for their own sake. Many researchers believe they held ritual or spiritual significance, perhaps created as part of ceremonies meant to ensure successful hunts or to honor unseen forces. The birth of symbolic thought also marked the dawn of spirituality. The deliberate placement of objects with the dead beads, pigments, carved figures suggests that early humans were beginning to contemplate existence beyond life. Graves were no longer just places to lay a body. They became sites of meaning, memory, and possibly belief in an afterlife. A stone tool placed beside a skeleton or a necklace draped over a long-gone neck are gestures that speak of love, respect, and the belief that part of the individual endures beyond death. Once humans could create symbols, they could also build systems of meaning. Patterns carved into ochre could evolve into traditions. Painted animals might represent myths or serve as teaching tools. Shell beads could signal alliances between groups, and as symbols accumulated, they formed the scaffolding for the vast structures of belief, art, and culture that would define our species. This new way of thinking did more than decorate cave walls or adorn bodies. It opened a door to imagination. A mark could stand for an idea, a painting could capture a story, a burial could express hope or fear of what comes after. With each symbolic act, the human mind expanded its reach beyond what was immediately present into realms of possibility, memory, and dream. What began as a few etched lines and beads of ochre would eventually give rise to myths, religions, art, science, and philosophy. The symbolic spark that flickered in Blombos cave would one day blaze into cathedrals and poems, equations and novels. It is the root of everything that makes us human: our ability to imagine, to question, to assign meaning to the world around us. The handprint on a cave wall, the bead placed on a corpse, the carved pattern on a piece of ochre. These are not just relics of a distant past. They are the earliest signs of a mind learning to think beyond the visible, to shape meaning from matter, and to weave stories that would outlive their creators. In those first sparks of symbolism, humanity began to understand not just the world, but itself. Long before alphabets were carved into stone or stories were inked onto pages, humans discovered a force that would change the course of our evolution more profoundly than any tool or weapon. It was not something forged from metal or crafted from wood. It was carried on breath, shaped by muscle, and passed invisibly from one mind into another. It was language, and once it emerged, the world would never again be the same. The rise of language was not sudden. It was a biological, neurological, and social transformation that unfolded gradually across hundreds of thousands of years. The foundation of this change began deep within the body. Over time, the base of the skull shifted, and the larynx, the voice box, descended lower in the throat, creating a longer vocal tract. This simple change dramatically increased the variety of sounds our ancestors could produce. Subtle alterations to the tongue followed, giving it greater flexibility and fine motor control, while the muscles of the lips and face evolved to allow delicate articulation. Even the chest and diaphragm adapted to provide sustained, controlled breath, enabling humans to speak for extended periods rather than in short bursts. But the most profound changes occurred within the brain. Specific regions, notably Broca's area, linked to speech production, and Wernicke's area, associated with language comprehension, became more complex and interconnected. These networks linked sound to meaning, meaning to memory, and memory to action, allowing humans not just to vocalize, but to encode and decode intricate patterns of communication. Evolution also strengthened the neural pathways between the brain's hemispheres, enhancing the speed and sophistication with which thoughts could be translated into words. At first, language likely existed as simple vocalizations paired with gestures, warnings, calls, or signals used during hunts or group movement. But as anatomy and cognition advanced, these crude sounds evolved into structured sequences that could convey far more than immediate reactions. Words could now represent specific objects, actions, or places. Sentences could describe events distant in time or space. For the first time, communication extended beyond the present moment. This new ability reshaped how early humans lived together. Before language, cooperation relied heavily on what could be seen or mimed. With spoken communication, groups could plan elaborate hunting strategies, assigning roles and coordinating timing with precision. A leader could describe how prey might behave miles away. Hunters could discuss wind direction, terrain, and ambush tactics before the chase even began. Shared speech transformed group action from instinctive reaction into coordinated strategy. The effects on daily life were equally profound. Parents could now teach their offspring how to craft tools or identify edible plants, not just by showing them, but by explaining the process. Knowledge no longer had to be rediscovered by each generation through trial and error. Instead, it could be stored in memory, shaped into words, and passed on like a torch. This accelerated cultural evolution dramatically. Skills, discoveries, and observations accumulated over generations, building a shared body of knowledge far greater than any individual could amass alone. Language also expanded the reach of collective problem solving. A difficult puzzle, how to build a stronger shelter, how to cross a river, how to trap an elusive prey, could now be tackled by many minds, working together through shared dialogue. Ideas could be proposed, debated, refined, and improved upon. Solutions could evolve within a single conversation rather than over lifetimes. This ability to pool intelligence allowed humans to adapt rapidly to new challenges and environments, far outpacing other species whose knowledge was limited to individual experience. Over time, language became the foundation upon which entire societies were built. It allowed groups to form laws, traditions, and systems of governance. It made negotiation and alliance possible between distant bands. It enabled the sharing of stories that preserved the memory of ancestors and the lessons of past events. Through spoken words, values and morals could be taught, disputes resolved, and identities defined. Culture itself became a living network of ideas, sustained and transmitted by language. The emergence of speech also altered how humans thought. Words provided categories for complex ideas, making abstract reasoning easier. Concepts like number, time, and cause could be discussed, measured, and manipulated. Language allowed humans to examine their own actions, question their motives, and plan for futures that had not yet arrived. In many ways, language did not just express thought, it shaped it. As language spread and diversified, so did humanity's capacity for collaboration. Small family groups became bands. Bands formed tribes. Tribes grew into communities and, eventually, civilizations. At every stage, language was the invisible thread weaving individuals into collective wholes, allowing them to act with a unity and foresight unmatched in the natural world. From the first simple calls exchanged on the African plains to the thousands of languages spoken today, this capacity for shared speech remains one of our most defining traits. It is how we transmit knowledge, solve problems, build relationships, and imagine futures together. It is the reason that ideas outlive their creators and that wisdom can cross centuries. Language did not simply give humans a voice. It gave them the means to think together, to remember together, and to shape their destiny together. And in that shared thought spoken, heard, and passed forward lies the power that has carried our species from scattered bands of hunter-gatherers to the builders of a connected and ever-evolving world. In a landscape of shifting winds and restless skies, a new kind of creature began to walk the earth. They were not stronger than their cousins, nor faster, nor better equipped with claws or teeth. But something had changed inside their skulls, a quiet revolution unfolding behind their eyes. They were called Homo sapiens, and with their arrival, the story of life entered an entirely new chapter. Their beginnings trace back to Africa roughly 300,000 years ago, in a world both familiar and alien. Grasslands stretched wide beneath the sun, dotted with herds of grazing animals. Forest edges shimmered with bird song and the rustle of predators. Rivers carved their slow paths through savannas, offering life to the creatures that gathered at their banks. Amid this tapestry of survival, Homo sapiens were born not as a sudden appearance, but as the latest branch on a tree that had been growing for millions of years. At first glance, they looked much like the humans who came before them. They walked upright, they shaped tools, they hunted and gathered. But deep inside their minds, subtle changes had been accumulating. Their brains, while not vastly larger, had become wired in new and intricate ways. Neural pathways multiplied, connecting regions responsible for memory, emotion, planning, and creativity. These connections gave rise to something unprecedented, the ability to imagine worlds that did not yet exist. With imagination came possibilities that stretched far beyond the immediate present. Earlier, humans had made tools by chipping stones into simple blades. Homo sapiens began to craft with purpose and foresight. They designed specialized points for hunting different animals. They combined materials, binding stone to wood with resins and sinew to create spears and axes. They fashioned needles from bone to stitch hides into clothing suited for cold nights and distant migrations. This was more than adaptation, it was invention. But their creativity was not confined to survival, it spilled into every corner of life. They carved patterns into ochre and etched designs into bone, expressions that had no practical purpose but carried meaning all the same. They strung shells into necklaces and painted the walls of caves with images of animals, hunts, and spirits. These were not mere decorations. They were symbols, signs that Homo sapiens had begun to think not just about what is, but what could be. This capacity for abstract thought reshaped how they saw the world and their place within it. They could plan hunts not just for tomorrow, but for seasons ahead. They could imagine the movements of herds, the shifts of rivers, and the cycles of the sky. They could prepare for hardships that had not yet arrived. Over time, this ability to project forward gave them a remarkable edge. It allowed them to thrive in landscapes that once would have seemed impossible, from dense tropical forests to icy tundras far from their ancestral home. Their minds also transformed the fabric of their societies. Where earlier hominins relied on simple cooperation, Homo sapiens built complex social networks. They shared knowledge widely, teaching not just the young, but anyone who would listen. Ideas flowed between individuals and groups, evolving as they passed from one person to the next. They created myths and stories that explained the forces of nature and bound communities together under shared beliefs. Through these stories, they found unity, and unity made them strong. Language deepened this transformation. With words, they could convey abstract ideas, describe distant places, and pass on intricate skills. Knowledge no longer died with the individual but lived on, accumulating across generations. Each discovery became a foundation for the next. Fire led to cooking, cooking to metallurgy, metallurgy to tools that reshaped landscapes. What one person imagined, another could refine, and another could improve still further. This collective imagination allowed Homo sapiens to transcend the limitations of biology. A single human remained vulnerable, but together they could fell giants, cross vast oceans, and survive freezing winters. They were no longer shaped solely by their environment. They had begun to shape the environment itself, building shelters, digging wells, taming plants, and eventually bending rivers and mountains to their will. The leap from survival to creation marked a turning point unlike any other in the history of life. For billions of years, living things had adapted to their surroundings. Now, one species was adapting the surroundings to itself. That shift began with the same hands and feet shared by their ancestors, but it was driven by something entirely new: the capacity to dream, to plan, to imagine. It was imagination that carried Homo sapiens out of Africa, across deserts, over mountains, and eventually to every corner of the globe. It was imagination that allowed them to see possibilities hidden in stone, fire, and stars. And it was imagination that would one day lead them to build cities, write laws, compose music, and send their creations beyond the sky. The arrival of Homo sapiens was not simply the rise of a new species, it was the dawn of a new way of thinking, a way of shaping reality, not by strength or instinct, but by ideas. And from that quiet revolution, the story of humanity truly began to unfold. By the time Homo sapiens had begun to spread beyond Africa, the world was already inhabited. Across forests, plains, and mountains, other kinds of humans walked the land, some broad and powerful, others mysterious and little understood. They had been there for hundreds of thousands of years, shaped by their own battles with cold and hunger, their own stories written into the stones and rivers of their homelands. And when our ancestors met them, they did not always compete. Sometimes they shared food, sometimes they shared knowledge, and sometimes They shared blood. For a long time, scientists believed that these encounters had ended in one-sided replacement, that Homo sapiens had swept across the continents and outcompeted all others. But the truth hidden in our DNA tells a far more intricate story. Deep within the genome of every person alive today lies a record of ancient meetings, traces of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and perhaps even other lineages we have yet to name. Humanity, it turns out, is not a single pure thread. It is a woven fabric, a mosaic of many species that once walked this earth. The most familiar of these relatives were the Neanderthals, who had spread across Europe and Western Asia long before modern humans arrived. They were powerful and intelligent, adapted to life in cold, glacial landscapes. When Homo sapiens reached their territory around 60,000 years ago, the two species met face to face. They were not strangers in form. They recognized something of themselves in one another. They shared tools, similar gestures, perhaps even similar sounds and expressions, and they mated. Today, nearly everyone of non-African ancestry carries between 1 and 2% Neanderthal DNA. It is a small amount, but its influence runs deep. Some of these ancient genes help regulate how our immune systems respond to pathogens, shaped by Neanderthals' long exposure to the viruses and bacteria of Eurasia. Others influence the way our skin reacts to sunlight, or how fat is stored in the body, adaptations that once helped them endure frigid Ice Age winters. Even aspects of mood, sleep, and pain sensitivity trace back to these distant unions. In ways subtle and profound, their legacy still lives within us. Farther east, another encounter left its mark. High in the mountains of Siberia, deep within a cave known as Denisova, scientists uncovered a single fragment of a finger bone. From that tiny fossil, a new chapter of human history emerged. Genetic analysis revealed a lineage distinct from both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. These were the Denisovans, a people whose existence had gone completely unnoticed until their DNA gave them a voice from the past. Although their fossils remain scarce, their genetic fingerprints are written across the populations of Asia and Oceania. People from Tibet, for example, carry Denisovan genes that allow them to thrive at high altitudes, efficiently using oxygen where the air is thin. In parts of Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands, Denisovan DNA contributes to immune system function, offering resistance to ancient diseases. Even without knowing much about their culture or appearance, we know they shaped who we are. Some discoveries hint that these were not isolated events, but part of a long and complicated pattern. A single bone from Denisova Cave belonged to a girl whose mother was a Neanderthal and whose father was a Denisovan. Elsewhere, genetic evidence suggests that Denisovans themselves may have interbred with an even older, unknown human lineage. This tangled web of relationships blurs the boundaries between what we once called species. It shows that evolution did not move in a straight line from primitive to modern. It was a branching, intertwining process, a story of contact, connection, and shared survival. Even within Africa, long considered the cradle of a single uninterrupted lineage, clues are beginning to emerge of ancient mixtures. Some populations carry traces of genetic material that do not match any known group, suggesting encounters with now extinct lineages that have yet to be identified. These findings remind us that the diversity of the human story runs deeper than we once imagined, stretching back into forgotten chapters still buried beneath the soil. The effects of these unions reach beyond biology. Interbreeding may have also shaped behavior and culture in ways we are only beginning to understand. Ideas, skills, and knowledge could have passed between groups as they met and mingled. Tool-making techniques may have spread, as well as strategies for hunting, shelter building, or fire use. Even symbolic behaviors, the use of pigments, ornaments, or rituals, might have been shared and transformed through contact. Humanity did not evolve in isolation, but within a network of exchanges that enriched our capabilities. When we look in the mirror today, we are seeing more than the face of Homo sapiens. We are seeing fragments of Neanderthal strength, Denisovan resilience, and echoes of other ancestors whose names we may never know. Each of us carries within our cells a record of ancient journeys and encounters, a living archive of the deep past. We are not the pure descendants of a single lineage, but the sum of many, woven together over millennia into a single, diverse species. Our blood tells a story far more complex than conquest and replacement. It is a story of meeting and mingling, of survival through connection. And it reminds us that the boundary between us and them has always been far softer and more porous than we once believed. For most of our species' history, survival has never been guaranteed. At several points along the long road from our ancient origins to the present, humanity has stood on the brink of extinction. Entire populations dwindled to tiny remnants, and the fate of our lineage rested on the survival of a few scattered groups. The fact that we are here at all is a testament to resilience and to the chance that, again and again, allowed just enough of us to endure. One of the most dramatic examples of this fragility comes from the field of genetics. Scientists studying the human genome have discovered evidence of ancient bottlenecks, periods when our global population shrank to such a small size that genetic diversity nearly vanished. Every person alive today carries the imprint of those crises. The range of variation in our DNA is remarkably narrow compared to many other species, and that genetic uniformity is a clue to how close we came to disappearing entirely. The most infamous of these bottlenecks is tied to a single event, one so cataclysmic it may have reduced humanity's numbers to just a few thousand individuals. It began about 74,000 years ago, deep beneath the surface of what is now the Indonesian island of Sumatra. For millennia, magma had been building beneath the Earth's crust, trapped and growing more volatile with every passing century. Then, in a moment of unimaginable violence, the Toba supervolcano erupted. Toba was not an ordinary eruption. It was one of the largest volcanic events in the past 2 million years. More than 2,000 cubic kilometers of ash and debris exploded into the atmosphere. The blast was so immense that it carved out a caldera more than 60 miles across, now filled by Lake Toba. Shock waves rippled through the air, and pyroclastic flows scoured the land for miles in every direction. The effects did not end there. A vast column of ash and sulfuric gases rose high into the stratosphere, where winds carried it around the globe. The aftermath was apocalyptic. Sunlight dimmed as airborne particles reflected solar radiation back into space. Global temperatures dropped, perhaps by several degrees, plunging the world into a volcanic winter that may have lasted for years. Rainfall patterns shifted, ecosystems collapsed, and many plant species died. With vegetation gone, herbivores starved, and predators soon followed. Entire food webs unraveled, leaving little for humans to eat. Genetic evidence suggests that the consequences for our species were severe. Some studies estimate that humanity's global population may have fallen to fewer than 10,000 individuals, perhaps as few as 2,000 or 3,000. Small, isolated groups scattered across Africa and parts of southern Asia were all that remained. Entire lineages were likely lost forever, and with them, countless unique genetic variations. Our species, already young and vulnerable, hovered on the edge of annihilation. The story of Toba is the most dramatic example we know, but it was not the only moment when disaster threatened to erase us. Roughly 135,000 years ago, long before the eruption, a series of prolonged climate shifts likely caused a significant population crash. Africa, then our primary home, underwent periods of extreme aridity. Vast regions turned to desert, water sources dried up, and plant and animal life declined sharply. Genetic evidence suggests that during this time, Homo sapiens may have dwindled to a few thousand individuals, possibly confined to isolated refuges near rivers, coasts, or highland forests where conditions were more stable. Other catastrophes, though less well documented, may also have played a role in shaping our history. Massive volcanic eruptions elsewhere in the world could have triggered regional die-offs. Epidemics, fueled by pathogens to which early humans had no resistance, might have swept through small populations. Even asteroid impacts, though rarer, could have drastically altered climates and ecosystems. Each of these events added its own pressure to the already precarious existence of early humans. Yet what is most remarkable about these near extinctions is not the devastation they caused, but the adaptations they inspired. In the aftermath of Toba, humans who survived were forced to change their behaviors to cope with a colder, harsher world. They exploited new food sources, including shellfish and other coastal resources. They learned to migrate to more stable climates, following rivers and shorelines that provided a consistent supply of water and food. They likely forged stronger social bonds as cooperation became critical to enduring the leanest times. These ancient bottlenecks also shaped who we are today. The reduced genetic diversity of modern humans is a direct legacy of those crises. Traits that aided survival, such as adaptability, cooperation, and problem solving, were naturally selected and reinforced in the small groups that endured. Over time, those qualities became defining features of our species. In the long view of history, humanity's survival has never been a straight, unbroken line. It has been a story of narrow escapes and improbable recoveries, of light that nearly went out but flared again against the odds. The ash of Toba still lies buried in geological layers around the world, a silent witness to how close we came to vanishing. And yet, from that brink, we endured fewer, perhaps humbler, but stronger and more resilient. Every human alive today is a descendant of those who survived the worst nature could throw at them. Their resilience is written into our genes and reflected in our instincts to adapt, cooperate, and persevere. The catastrophes that almost ended us did more than test our species. They forged it. For all our cleverness, humans were never destined to rule the world because of strength. We had no claws, no fangs, and no armor to protect us. Alone, our ancestors were vulnerable, frail bodies in a landscape ruled by predators faster, stronger, and far more deadly. And yet, against all odds, we spread across the planet, built vast cities, crossed oceans, and even set foot on the moon. The reason is simple, but it is also the most powerful force in our history. We learned how to work together. Cooperation was humanity's invisible weapon, a quiet superpower that allowed small bands of hunter-gatherers to achieve things no individual ever could. In the beginning, it was simple. Families hunted, shared food, and protected one another. But over time, cooperation grew into something far more ambitious. It expanded beyond bloodlines and kinship, linking groups that might otherwise have been strangers. These connections turned scattered populations into thriving networks and eventually into societies. One of the first signs of this deeper cooperation can be seen in the earliest trade. Long before there were markets or currency, groups that lived far apart exchanged goods they could not obtain on their own. Those near the coast might offer shells, fish, or salt, while inland groups provided stone tools, animal hides, or ochre pigments. These trades weren't just about survival, they built trust, strengthened relationships, and laid the foundation for future alliances. Over thousands of years, such exchanges created webs of connection that stretched across continents, turning isolated groups into a single, interlinked species. But cooperation wasn't only about goods, it was about knowledge too. Human memory is fragile, but shared memory is enduring. Skills, stories, and discoveries didn't die with the people who made them. They were taught, retaught, and refined. Knowledge was passed from elders to children, from one generation to the next, growing richer and more complex with time. One person might learn how to shape a sharper blade, another how to track an animal's footprints across dry earth. Together, those skills combined into strategies and technologies no individual could have created alone. It was as if humanity's collective mind was larger than the sum of its parts. As populations grew and encounters between groups became more frequent, cooperation evolved again into alliances and diplomacy. Some of these early partnerships were sealed through shared rituals or the exchange of symbolic gifts. Others were maintained through marriage between groups, weaving networks of kinship that reduced conflict and expanded influence. These alliances were more than just agreements, they were early forms of social organization, creating the first steps toward leadership, negotiation, and political structure. Trade routes widened, stories and ideas traveled farther. New technologies, from stone blades to woven fabrics, spread across regions faster than ever before. And as people learned to depend on one another for more than just food or shelter, societies became more specialized. Some individuals focused on toolmaking, others on gathering plants, healing the sick, or shaping clay. This division of labor meant that communities could achieve tasks that would have been impossible for a single person or family. Villages grew around this shared effort. Villages became towns, towns became cities, and as cities rose, cooperation scaled again, this time into something vast. Entire societies coordinated the construction of irrigation systems that fed thousands, monuments that honored their ancestors, and roads that stretched across landscapes. People began to work for goals that would never be completed, in their own lifetime projects that only made sense when shared across generations. Cooperation was no longer just a means of survival, it had become the engine of progress. Even our brains bear the imprint of this legacy. They evolved to navigate complex social worlds, to understand intentions, build trust, negotiate, and empathize. We are wired to connect. The joy we feel when working together, the comfort of belonging to a group, the instinct to help a stranger in need, all of it is the result of millions of years of evolutionary pressure to cooperate. It is easy to think of humanity's greatest achievements, agriculture, architecture, science, space travel, as triumphs of technology, but they are, at their core, triumphs of collaboration. Without the invisible bonds that link us together, none of it would exist. Cooperation allowed small bands of hunter-gatherers to cross deserts and oceans. It fueled the rise of civilizations, and it continues to shape the way we solve problems, share ideas, and imagine futures far beyond what any one of us could dream alone. In the end, this is our greatest superpower, not strength, not speed, but the simple, extraordinary ability to look at one another and decide that together we can do what none of us could do alone. For countless generations, humanity's story unfolded in familiar landscapes, the grasslands and river valleys of Africa, where our species first took shape. But somewhere around 70,000 years ago, a remarkable chapter began. Our ancestors stopped seeing the horizon as a boundary and started treating it as an invitation. Step by step, driven by curiosity, necessity, and the quiet pull of possibility, they embarked on the journey that would scatter their descendants across every continent. It was the last great migration, and it would change the course of our species forever. It started with small, almost hesitant movements, not mass exoduses, but scattered groups leaving Africa and pressing outward into unfamiliar lands. They did not know they were beginning a planetary conquest. They were simply following rivers, tracking herds, or seeking food and safety in the face of shifting climates. But each of those choices, each step beyond the familiar, set humanity on a path that would eventually circle the globe. The first pioneers crossed the narrow waters of the Red Sea into the Arabian Peninsula. From there, they traced the contours of coastlines, following the beachcomber route along the shores of the Indian Ocean. The seas were lower then, locked away in vast ice sheets, exposing new land and shallower crossings. These early travelers hugged the coasts, living on fish, shellfish, and the bounty of tidal zones, a strategy that allowed them to move thousands of miles without needing to conquer deserts or cross mountain ranges. As generations passed, their descendants pushed deeper into Asia. By 50,000 years ago, humans had accomplished one of their first true feats of exploration, reaching Australia. Even with sea levels at their ice age lows, the journey required crossing channels of open water. They likely lashed together logs, fashioned primitive rafts, and pushed out into the unknown, guided by the sight of distant land on the horizon, or perhaps simply the courage to follow the setting sun. It was a moment of quiet genius. For the first time, humans were not just travelers on land, but navigators of the sea. Others turned north, venturing into colder, harsher regions that demanded entirely new ways of living. In the icy heart of Eurasia, survival required invention. Humans stitched hides into layered garments, built shelters from mammoth bones and animal skins, and learned to store meat for the long, sunless winters. They hunted colossal beasts, mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, steppe bison with carefully crafted spears, and coordinated strategies that spoke to a new level of intelligence and cooperation. In these frozen landscapes, technology and adaptation became as vital as fire or food. The expansion was not just physical, it was cultural. As groups spread farther apart, they evolved unique ways of life suited to their surroundings. In the dense forests of Southeast Asia, people mastered the art of moving silently through tangled vegetation and learned to exploit a dizzying variety of plants and animals. In arid deserts, they tracked hidden springs, hunted nocturnal prey, and navigated by the stars. On the windswept steppes of Central Asia, they followed vast herds across endless plains, learning the rhythms of migration and the patterns of the seasons. Each new environment shaped them, not just their tools and diets, but their stories, their beliefs, and their identities. One of humanity's final frontiers was the Americas. During the last ice age, so much water was locked in polar ice that sea levels fell dramatically, exposing a vast land bridge between Siberia and Alaska. Sometime between 15 and 20,000 years ago, small groups crossed this frozen passage, following mammoth herds into a continent untouched by human feet. From there, they spread with astonishing speed, within a few thousand years reaching Patagonia at the southern tip of South America. Along the way, they mastered every environment the continent offered: tundra and prairie, desert and jungle, mountain and coast. This global expansion did more than scatter our species. it transformed us into something new. As isolated populations adapted to their surroundings, physical differences emerged: lighter skin in regions with weaker sunlight, stockier builds in colder climates, and lungs that thrived in the thin air of high mountain valleys. Languages splintered and diversified, shaped by distance and isolation. Customs, myths, and technologies evolved independently, creating a dazzling mosaic of human culture. Yet, beneath all those differences lay a shared ancestry, a single story that began on the plains of Africa and radiated outward to every edge of the earth. Ideas traveled along with people. Knowledge about fire, tool making, and food preparation spread slowly but steadily, carried from group to group through encounters, exchanges, and intermarriage. Over time, these networks of interaction grew into something larger: the earliest trade routes, the first alliances, and the fragile threads of diplomacy that would one day bind entire civilizations together. By the end of the Ice Age, around 12,000 years ago, humanity had achieved something no other species in Earth's history had ever done. We had made the entire planet our home, from the polar ice caps to the equatorial forests, from island chains scattered across the Pacific to the high plateaus of the Andes. Humans lived, adapted, and thrived. The final great migration was not a single journey, but millions of them, countless footsteps taken across rivers, deserts, and oceans, each one expanding the map of what was possible. And in the end, those journeys shaped more than our geography. They forged a species defined by exploration, restless, inventive, and forever reaching beyond the next horizon. The world we know today, diverse, interconnected, and endlessly creative, was born from those ancient wanderers who refused to stay still. For most of our species' existence, we were not alone. The earth once held many kinds of humans, scattered across continents and shaped by different environments. Some were stocky and strong, adapted to frozen plains and bitter winds. Others were small and nimble, perfectly suited to life in dense forests or on remote islands. Some we know from skeletons and tools, others only from faint traces in our DNA. But today, every branch of that once crowded family tree has withered. Except for one, we are all that remains. The disappearance of the other humans is one of the great mysteries of our past. It did not happen in a single moment, nor was it the same story everywhere. Their decline unfolded slowly, in waves and patterns, over tens of thousands of years. And while scientists have pieced together many clues, there is still no single explanation for why they vanished while we endured. Instead, it seems their fall was the result of many forces converging at once. One of those forces was competition. Wherever Homo sapiens spread, they encountered other humans already living there. Neanderthals had roamed Europe and parts of Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years, perfectly adapted to the cold climates of the Ice Age. In the East, Denisovans had carved out their own territory, leaving behind only scattered traces of their existence. On isolated islands, species like Homo floresiensis and Homo luzonensis had survived in evolutionary bubbles, their small bodies and unique features shaped by life in isolation. When modern humans arrived, they brought new ways of thinking, new tools, and new strategies. Their weapons were often more efficient, their social networks larger, their ability to adapt more flexible. They could form alliances, share knowledge quickly, and coordinate hunts or defenses on a scale that older species may have struggled to match. In a world where resources were often scarce, this edge could mean the difference between survival and extinction. Competition did not always mean violence, but conflict likely played a role in some places. Archaeological sites show evidence of injuries and trauma that hint at clashes between groups. The pressures of limited food, changing climates, and expanding populations would have intensified tensions. Even small skirmishes, repeated over centuries, could tip the balance. Over time, these encounters may have reduced the numbers of other human species, pushing them toward decline. Yet not all interactions were hostile. In many cases, humans and their cousins met, lived side by side, and even shared their lives. Genetic evidence reveals that interbreeding occurred multiple times across different regions. People living outside Africa today still carry traces of Neanderthal DNA, while populations in parts of Asia and Oceania carry Denisovan genes. These fragments of ancient inheritance shaped our immune systems, helped us adapt to colder climates and higher altitudes, and influenced traits we still carry. This blending of lineages shows that extinction was not always a simple story of one species replacing another. In some cases, the others did not disappear entirely. They became part of us. Their legacy flows in our blood, their genes woven into the fabric of modern humanity. But even so, their distinct identities eventually faded, absorbed into a larger population. Environmental change was another powerful force shaping their fate. As the last ice age advanced and retreated, landscapes transformed again and again. Forests gave way to grasslands, rivers dried up, and coastlines shifted. Species that had adapted to specific environments found their niches shrinking or vanishing entirely. Neanderthals, for instance, were built for cold glacial worlds. As the climate warmed and the ecosystems they depended on changed, their survival strategies may have become less effective. Small, isolated populations were especially vulnerable to these shifts. A harsh winter, a disease outbreak, or a single failed hunting season could have catastrophic consequences. Catastrophe itself may also have played a part. Volcanic eruptions, like the massive Toba event, could have disrupted ecosystems and decimated populations. Epidemics, introduced through contact with other human groups, might have spread rapidly among species with little immunity. Even the arrival of new predators, competition from expanding Homo sapiens populations, or the overhunting of key prey could have pushed some groups beyond the point of recovery. In the end, the disappearance of the others was likely not caused by any single event. It was the combined weight of many pressures: competition, assimilation, environmental change, and perhaps sheer chance that slowly erased them from the world. Some dwindled until their numbers were too small to sustain a population. Others were absorbed into ours, their identities dissolving over generations. Some may have held on far longer than we realize, surviving in remote pockets long after most had vanished. Their absence leaves behind more than unanswered questions. It shapes how we understand ourselves. We were not destined to be the last humans, nor were we necessarily the most deserving. We were simply the ones who, through a combination of adaptability, cooperation, and luck, managed to endure. But the others are not truly gone. They live on in our genes, in the echoes of their tools and art, and in the lessons they left behind. Their story is part of our story, inseparable from our own. And though their names have faded into prehistory, their presence lingers in the very shape of who we are. Every time you take a step, stretch a limb, or even breathe, you are repeating movements shaped by millions of years of history. The human body is not a blank canvas, designed fresh and new. It is a living archive, a museum of ancient solutions to ancient problems, refined and repurposed, but never entirely erased. We often think of evolution as something that happened long ago, but its fingerprints are still everywhere in the way we walk, the way we sleep, the instincts that stir beneath our thoughts, and even in the odd quirks of anatomy that serve no purpose anymore. Walking on two legs is one of the most defining traits of our species, and yet it is one of our oldest inheritances. It was not a choice, but a necessity born of survival. Millions of years ago, our ancestors began leaving the safety of the trees for a more open world. Standing upright allowed them to see farther across the savannas, to spot predators before it was too late. It freed their hands to carry food, wield tools, and care for their young. And it made traveling long distances more efficient, turning humans into some of the best endurance walkers and runners in the animal kingdom. But this new way of moving came with trade-offs. Our spine, originally shaped for a life spent on all fours, had to curve to balance an upright frame. Our pelvis shifted to support internal organs against gravity. Knees and feet changed shape to absorb the impact of walking. These changes made us extraordinary travelers, but they also left us vulnerable to back pain, knee injuries, and other physical problems. Every ache after a long day of standing is a small reminder of our body's evolutionary compromises. Running, too, is part of this deep inheritance. Unlike most animals, humans are built for endurance rather than speed. Our long legs, spring-like tendons, and ability to sweat allow us to travel vast distances without overheating. Early humans likely used this to their advantage in a technique known as persistence hunting, chasing animals until they collapsed from exhaustion. Even though few people hunt this way now, the ability remains. Marathon runners and long-distance hikers tap into the same ancient physiology that once allowed our ancestors to survive on the open plains. The rhythms of our bodies are shaped by evolution in ways we rarely notice. Sleep, for instance, is not just rest but a survival strategy honed by time. Early humans who slept lightly and woke easily were more likely to survive threats in the night. Even today, many people naturally wake during the night, a relic of this ancient vigilance. Our sleep cycles are also tuned to natural light. The rising and setting of the sun once dictated daily life, and our internal clocks still respond to those patterns, even in a world lit by electricity. Beneath our conscious minds, older instincts still guide us. A sudden loud noise triggers a startle reflex, tightening muscles and quickening the heartbeat, just as it did when our ancestors faced predators in the dark. The hairs on your neck rising when you are frightened, or the adrenaline surge when danger appears, are echoes of a time when those reactions could mean the difference between life and death. Even the fear of heights, snakes, or confined spaces common across cultures likely traces back to threats that shaped our evolutionary past. Our bodies also carry physical reminders of where we came from, small quirks and remnants that no longer serve a purpose. The appendix, once essential for digesting tough plant material, now plays only a minor role in immunity. Wisdom teeth, which helped our ancestors chew fibrous roots and raw meat, often become more trouble than they are worth in modern diets. Tiny muscles in our skin contract when we are cold or scared, causing goosebumps, a reaction that once puffed up our ancestors' fur to make them look larger or trap heat. Even the tailbone, or coccyx, is a vestige of a tail long gone, a structural memory from a time when our ancestors swung through trees. Some features are less obvious but just as ancient. The way our eyes adjust to sudden darkness is a survival tool from when night meant vulnerability. The way babies instinctively grip a finger is a leftover from ancestors who clung to their mother's fur. Even the hiccup, that strange and useless spasm, may be a remnant of ancient breathing patterns shared with amphibians. Our bodies are full of such ghosts, not flaws, but traces of a long journey. They remind us that evolution does not start over with each generation. It builds layer upon layer, modifying old designs rather than replacing them. A muscle once used for climbing might become part of a new posture. A reflex meant for self-defense might become part of our emotional landscape. When you walk, you carry the memory of the savannah in your stride. When you run, you echo the persistence of hunters who chased antelope across endless plains. When your heart races at a sudden sound, you replay the fears that once kept your ancestors alive. The body you inhabit is not just yours, it is a living fossil shaped by every creature that came before you. And in every heartbeat, every movement, every breath, their story continues. The human mind is often described as our most advanced achievement, a masterpiece of evolution that allows us to build cities, write poetry, and explore distant planets. But beneath that complexity lies something far older and simpler. Hidden within our thoughts are ancient instincts shaped in a world that no longer exists. Every decision, every emotion, and every fear carries echoes of lives lived under very different skies when survival depended less on logic and more on instincts honed over millions of years. Fear is one of the oldest of these instincts, a silent guardian that has protected life since long before humans walked the earth. For our distant ancestors, fear was a constant companion. It sharpened their senses, tensed their muscles, and readied them to fight or flee. A rustle in the tall grass might have signaled a lurking predator. A sudden shadow overhead could mean a swooping eagle. Those who hesitated often did not survive. Over time, fear became deeply embedded in the brain, woven into the neural circuits that govern our reactions. Even now, long after the saber-toothed cats and giant eagles have disappeared, that ancient system still guides us. We jump at sudden noises, startle at movement in the dark, and feel a surge of adrenaline when something seems threatening. The fear of snakes, spiders, and heights is nearly universal across cultures, even among people who have never encountered those dangers. These fears are not learned. They are inherited memories, ancient warnings passed down through countless generations. Empathy, too, has deep evolutionary roots. Life on the prehistoric savannas was harsh and often unpredictable. No one could survive entirely alone. Injured individuals needed help. Children required years of care. Sharing food and resources improved the chances of everyone's survival. Those who could sense the needs of others and respond to them were more likely to be supported in return. Over time, empathy became more than just a social skill. It became a survival strategy. This instinct still shapes the way we live. We feel a tug of concern when we see someone in pain, even a stranger. We are moved by stories of suffering and compelled to offer comfort or aid. These reactions are not just moral choices. They are the legacy of a time when cooperation was not optional but essential. The warmth of human connection, the joy of helping, and the pain we feel at another's loss are all traces of a brain designed to live in groups. Cooperation itself is one of the defining features of humanity, and its roots are older than civilization. Early humans depended on group effort to hunt large prey, defend territory, and care for young. Working together required communication, trust, and a shared sense of purpose. Those who excelled at cooperation were more likely to survive and pass on their genes. This selective pressure helped shape the complex social brains we carry today. Even in modern life, we seek belonging and approval, often without realizing why. The desire to be part of a group, to contribute and be valued, is the whisper of an ancient need. The legacy of our evolutionary past also shapes the way we think. Many of the cognitive shortcuts our minds use, known as biases, were once useful tools for survival. For example, our tendency to notice threats more readily than neutral or positive information is a relic of a world where danger could mean death. It was better to mistake a shadow for a predator than to ignore a real one. Today, that same bias can make us anxious or overly cautious, even when no real danger exists. Similarly, our preference for immediate rewards over future benefits, known as temporal discounting, made sense in a world where tomorrow was never guaranteed. Eating food now, when it was available, increased the chances of living another day. But in the modern world, that instinct can lead to impulsive decisions that work against long-term goals. Even our tendency to trust those who look or act like us is an echo of a time when outsiders were often potential threats. What once protected small bands of humans from danger now fuels prejudice and division. These ancient patterns can be seen in countless aspects of daily life. The stress response that once prepared us to flee from predators now activates during traffic jams and work deadlines. The instinct to form tight-knit groups, once crucial for survival, now plays out in sports teams, political factions, and online communities. The drive to accumulate resources, once a hedge against famine, can become relentless consumption. Yet these instincts are not flaws. They are evidence of how deeply our past shapes us. They remind us that the human mind was not designed for skyscrapers and smartphones. It was shaped in a world of scarcity and danger, of small groups and constant uncertainty. Every fear, every impulse, every moment of compassion carries the memory of that world. We are not separate from our ancestors. Their struggles and solutions live on inside us, guiding us in ways we rarely notice. And though the world has changed beyond recognition, those ancient instincts continue to shape our choices, our societies, and our sense of what it means to be human. When we think of evolution, we often imagine it as something that happened long ago, in distant ages filled with mammoths and stone tools. It is easy to picture our ancestors slowly changing over millions of years before finally arriving at the form we see in the mirror today. But evolution is not a story with a clear beginning and end. It is a continuous process, a river that never stops flowing. And even now, in a world shaped by cities and technology, we are still being carried forward by that current. The forces that guide evolution have not disappeared. They have simply changed shape. Natural selection, the slow and steady filtering of traits based on survival and reproduction, still operates within our species, though often in subtle ways. In the past, survival was determined by factors like climate, predators, or food scarcity. Today, it may be influenced by medicine, lifestyle, or even the choices we make about where and how we live. Yet, the underlying process remains the same. One of the clearest signs that humans continue to evolve comes from our relationship with food. For most of our history, humans were hunter-gatherers, living on diets of meat, fruits, roots, and wild plants. The arrival of agriculture around 10,000 years ago changed everything. People began eating grains, dairy, and cultivated plants, foods that their bodies had not encountered in such abundance before. Over generations, genetic changes emerged in response. One well-known example is lactase persistence, the ability to digest lactose, the sugar in milk, into adulthood. Most mammals lose this ability after weaning, but in some human populations, a genetic mutation allowed lactase production to continue. This change spread rapidly in regions where dairy farming was common, offering a valuable source of nutrition. It is why many people in Europe, parts of Africa, and the Middle East can drink milk easily, while others around the world are lactose intolerant. The difference is not a cultural one. It is evolution written into our genes. Diet has shaped us in other ways too. Populations that traditionally relied on high-starch foods, like rice or tubers, have evolved more copies of a gene called AMY, which helps break down starch. In areas where certain plants contain natural toxins, some groups have developed more efficient ways to process them. Even the way our bodies store fat, respond to sugar, or regulate appetite is influenced by ancient adaptations to scarcity adaptations that can become challenges in a modern world of abundance. Disease has also been a powerful driver of human evolution. For thousands of years, pathogens have shaped who survives and who does not. One striking example is the mutation that causes sickle cell trait. On its own, the mutation can lead to sickle cell disease, a serious condition. But in regions where malaria is common, carrying one copy of the gene offers protection against the deadly parasite. As a result, the mutation became widespread in certain parts of Africa and the Mediterranean. Other genetic changes, such as resistance to bubonic plague or tolerance to viruses, tell similar stories of humanity's long struggle against microscopic enemies. Even as medicine has reduced many of these pressures, new ones have emerged. The rapid spread of diseases, shifts in global diets, and environmental changes from climate to pollution all continue to shape the human genome. Our immune systems are constantly adapting to new threats, while our metabolisms adjust to new ways of living. Evolution does not stop simply because the challenges are different. Technology and culture, once thought to shield us from evolution, now play central roles in directing it. The rise of cities and agriculture has changed how we interact with the environment, altering everything from population density to disease exposure. Transportation and communication allow people from once isolated populations to mix, increasing genetic diversity and reducing the chances of harmful mutations becoming widespread. Meanwhile, reproductive choices influenced by social, cultural, and economic factors shape which traits are passed on and which fade over time. There is also growing evidence that our brains and behaviors are evolving. The human brain has not stopped changing since its earliest days, and subtle shifts may still be occurring. Some scientists suggest that changes in memory, attention, or emotional processing could be responses to the complexities of modern life. Others believe that the rise of cooperative societies and global communication is influencing how we think and interact. These changes are slow and difficult to measure, but they remind us that evolution affects more than just physical traits. Looking forward, the future of human evolution is filled with possibilities. Climate change may once again place selective pressures on our species, favoring traits that help us cope with heat, drought, or shifting ecosystems. Advances in medicine and genetic engineering may give us more direct control over our biology, raising profound questions about how much of our future evolution will be shaped by nature and how much by choice. Even if we cannot predict exactly where the river of evolution will carry us, one thing is certain: it has not stopped flowing. The forces that shaped our ancestors are still at work within us, guiding our bodies and minds in ways we may not yet understand. We are not the finished product of evolution, but a moment within it, a single chapter in a story that began long before us and will continue long after. And in that ongoing story, every heartbeat, every birth, every change, no matter how small, is another step in the unfinished experiment of being human. It is tempting to imagine history as a series of milestones, each one marked by a single defining moment. The first spark of fire, the first tool, the first city rising from the earth, and perhaps most of all, The first human a moment when an ape took a final step across an invisible line and became something new. But nature does not work in such neat divisions. Evolution is not a staircase with sudden leaps, but a slow, flowing river, shaping and reshaping its banks over countless generations. If you were to search for the very first human, you would never find them. There is no single face, no single birth, no single child that could claim that title. The story of humanity is not one of sharp beginnings, but of gradual transformation. Imagine traveling back in time, one generation at a time, from yourself to your parents, to your grandparents, and beyond. After a few hundred steps, you would meet people who spoke different languages, wore different clothes, and lived in simpler societies. A few thousand generations back, you would encounter ancestors who hunted with stone tools and gathered wild fruits. Farther still, the faces would grow more unfamiliar, their bodies more robust, their foreheads sloping, their tools more primitive. Yet in each generation, the changes would be small, almost imperceptible. There would never be a moment when you could say, "Here the ape ends and the human begins." This gradualness is the essence of evolution. Each generation is shaped by the world it inhabits, carrying small changes in its genes and behaviors. Some of those changes make survival a little easier and are passed on, others fade away. Over hundreds of thousands of years, those tiny changes accumulate, and what emerges is something new, not suddenly, but slowly, like dawn breaking over a long night. The ancestors we call Australopithecus did not wake up one morning as Homo habilis, nor did Homo erectus one day give birth to Homo sapiens. These were shifts measured in thousands of generations, each one bridging the gap between what came before and what came after. The idea of a single first human is also complicated by the fact that humanity was never a single, isolated lineage. As our ancestors evolved, they shared the world with others who were walking their own evolutionary paths. There were times when several human species existed at once, some closely related, others more distant. They met, shared knowledge, and sometimes interbred. Their genes mingled and flowed, blurring the boundaries even further. The story of humanity is not a straight line but a branching tree, its roots tangled deep in time. Even now, pieces of those other branches live on within us. The DNA of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and perhaps even older, unknown ancestors is woven into our own. In our immune systems, our metabolism, and the way our bodies respond to the environment, their legacy continues. We are not just the descendants of one species, but the living sum of many. Every step of evolution left its mark, and those marks are still with us. The continuity of this story is written not only in our genes, but in our bodies and minds. The way we walk still reflects decisions made millions of years ago when our ancestors first stood upright. The structure of our hands still carries the imprint of those who shaped stones and built fires. The instincts that guide our behavior, from the fear that makes our hearts race to the empathy that binds us to one another, are echoes of ancient lives lived in small, vulnerable groups. Even our curiosity, the restless urge to explore and understand, is an inheritance from ancestors who once peered beyond the next hill or followed a river to see where it led. If we could trace our lineage all the way back, through the forests of Africa, across the savannas, through oceans and ice ages, we would find that the story of humanity does not have a beginning. It is a thread that winds unbroken through time, twisting and branching, but never snapping. Every ancestor, from the first ape that stumbled onto two legs to the first maker of tools, from the gatherers of wild grains to the builders of cities, is part of that thread. Each one lives on, not as a memory, but as a living presence within us. The notion of a first human dissolves when seen in this light. There was no single child born into a family of apes who suddenly became something different. There were only generations, each one slightly more like us than the last. Humanity was not a spark that flared to life in a single moment. It was a slow and patient unfolding, a story written in countless lives over countless ages. To stand here now, with all our knowledge and technology, is not to stand apart from that story, but to be its latest chapter. Our bodies, our minds, and even our most ordinary habits are part of a continuum that stretches back millions of years. And just as there was never a first human, there will never be a last. The river of life flows on, carrying us into futures we cannot yet imagine, shaped by the same quiet forces that have always guided it.